You have come to a place that is not marked on any map. A place that exists only in the slow turning of the seasons and the memory of the limestone walls that hold the heat of the afternoon sun. The air here is different from the air outside. It is thicker with the scent of wild thyme and warm stone, and the faint dusty sweetness of old straw. You are standing just inside a low wooden door set deep within a high wall of pale grey stone that has been weathered by rain and wind for longer than anyone alive can remember. The door is heavy and iron-hinged, and it is closed behind you with a soft, final thud that seemed to push the rest of the world away and leave only the quiet hum of the garden to fill your ears. The sound that reaches you first is not a sound of words or of labor, but a deep, constant vibration, a living drone that seems to come from the earth itself and from the air above it all at once. And this is the sound of the bees. They are everywhere and nowhere in particular, a gentle blur of brown and gold that moves against the green of the leaves and the blue of the sky with no apparent urgency whatsoever. Only the steady, unhurried purpose of creatures who have all the time in the world to do exactly what must be done. You step forward onto a path made of flat stones, warmed smooth by the passage of feet, and the drip of water from the eaves of the small outbuilding to your left, and the stones are cool underfoot, even though the sun is high, and the day is warm with the slow, heavy warmth of the sun is high, and the day is warm with the slow, heavy warmth of early June in the south of France. The garden is not large in the way that grand estates are large. It is large only in the sense of being complete, of holding everything that is needed for a particular kind of quiet life, and nothing more. To your right, there is a long bed of lavender that has not yet come into full bloom, but is beginning to show the first hints of purple at the tips of its grey-green stalks, and the bees are paying it a great deal of attention, landing and taking off with a soft bounce of the stem that sets the whole plant trembling for just a moment before it returns to stillness. Beyond the lavender, there is a patch of rosemary that has grown woody and sprawling over the years, its branches reaching out across the stones, as if it is trying to catch the hem of your robe and pull you closer to its sharp, clean scent. And beyond the rosemary, against the far wall where the shadow lies deepest in the morning, and the stone stays cool until the sun finally climbs over the tiles of the roof, there are the skeps. You can see them now, 7 of them, arranged in a gentle curve along the base of the wall like overturned baskets left out to dry after a harvest, though these baskets are full of life, and the sound of them is the loudest thing in the whole garden. They are made of straw that has been coiled and bound and shaped into domes that rise from the flat stones of their pedestals, and each one has a small dark opening near the bottom where the bees come and go in a continuous, unhurried stream that never seems to change speed or direction, no matter how long you watch it. The straw is the color of pale honey in the sun and the color of rich earth in the shadow, and the tops of the skeps are covered with a kind of thatch that has been woven so tightly that the rain runs off it like water off a duck's back and leaves the inside dry and warm and safe for the thousands of small lives that pulse within. You find yourself drawn toward them without any conscious decision to move, and your feet carry you along the stone path that leads past a small well with a wooden cover and a bucket made of oak staves that is still wet from being lowered into the darkness this morning. The well is old, and the rope that holds the bucket is made of hemp that has been spliced and mended so many times that it is more knot than straight cord. But it holds, and it will continue to hold, because there is no one here who would pull too hard or ask more of it than it can give. The sound of the bees grows louder as you approach the skeps, not louder in a way that is startling or unpleasant, but louder in the way that a familiar sound becomes more present when you turn your attention fully toward it, like the voice of a friend who has been speaking softly in the next room, and now you have opened the door and entered the space where the words are being spoken. The air around the skeps is warm and moving with the vibration of thousands of tiny wings, and you can feel it on your skin like the faintest breeze, a breeze that smells of wax and propolis and the particular sweet-sour scent of a healthy hive that has been working all morning to gather nectar from the clover and the wildflowers that grow in the meadows beyond the monastery walls. You stop a few paces away from the nearest skep, and you simply stand there, your hands resting one inside the other at the level of your waist, your breathing slow and even, your eyes watching the entrance where the bees are performing the small miracle of their daily work, without any sense that they are being watched or that their work is anything other than the ordinary, necessary business of being alive. A bee lands on the edge of the opening and pauses there for a moment, as if it is checking the wind or remembering the exact location of the patch of time it visited just a few minutes ago. And then it pushes off again and rises into the air and is gone, replaced immediately by another bee that arrives from the opposite direction and disappears into the darkness of the hive without any hesitation at all. The pattern is endless and seamless, a living rope of coming and going that has been woven into the fabric of this garden since long before you were born and will continue long after you have returned to the dust from which all things come. This is the work of the beekeeper and this is the work of the bees, and it is the same work really. If you look at it from the right angle and with enough patience to see the connections that hold everything together in a quiet, unspoken order. You are the beekeeper, and you have come here to do the things that need to be done on this particular day, which is a day like many other days that have come before it and will come after it. A day of small tasks and slow movements and the kind of attention that can only be paid when there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. The skep in front of you is the oldest one in the garden, and you know it by the way the straw has darkened at the base where the dampness of the ground has worked its way into the fibers over the years, and by the way the thatch has been repaired in 3 places where the winter wind found a loose strand and pulled at it until it came free. You remember repairing that thatch last autumn with a bundle of fresh straw that you had gathered from the pile behind the tool shed. And you remember how the bees had been slow and sleepy in the cool air, and how they had barely noticed your hands moving over the surface of their home while you tucked the new straw into place and bound it with a length of twisted willow bark that you had soaked in the well water to make it pliable. The memory is not a sharp one. It is soft and worn at the edges like an old piece of cloth that has been folded and unfolded many times, and it blends into the other memories of other autumns and other repairs without any clear boundary between them. This is the way of the garden and the way of the bees, and the way of a life that is lived in the slow rhythm of the seasons rather than the quick rhythm of the world outside the walls. And it is a good way, a way that leaves room for breathing and for standing still and for listening to the sound of distant thunder that rumbles now and then from somewhere far beyond the valley to the north. You hear it again as you stand there, a low, muffled roll that might be mistaken for the sound of a cart passing over a wooden bridge if there were any bridges nearby or any carts that travelled on them. But there are none. The sound comes from much farther away, from a place that is not part of this garden or this monastery or this quiet corner of France, where the only things that move are the bees and the clouds and the slow hands of the man who tends the skeps. It is a sound that has been present on and off for several months now, a sound that the brothers in the monastery sometimes mention in low voices after the evening meal when they think no one else is listening. A sound that has something to do with the disagreements that have spread across the land like a crack in the dry earth of summer, spreading and branching and reaching into places where disagreements of this kind had never been known before. But here in the garden, the sound is only a sound, and it has no more meaning than the call of a crow or the rustle of the wind in the leaves of the old pear tree that grows against the south wall and drops its hard green fruit onto the stones in the late summer. You do not think about the sound, and you do not try to understand it, because understanding is not required for the work that you do and the life that you lead, and the bees do not understand it either, and they continue to fly and to gather and to build their small perfect hexagons of wax deep inside the darkness of the skep, where no human eye has ever seen them, and no human hand has ever seen them, and detides them except in the gentlest of ways during the honey harvest, when the time comes and the comes are heavy in the spet. The thunder rolls again, a little closer this time, or perhaps only a little louder, because the wind has shifted and is now carrying the sound more directly toward the monastery walls. And you lift your head and look toward the north, where the sky is still blue and clear, except for a thin line of grey cloud that sits on the horizon like a smudge of ash on a clean hearth. The cloud is too far away to bring any rain to this garden today, and it is too thin to block the sun that continues to warm the stones and the straw and the back of your neck, where the hood of your robe has slipped down and left your skin exposed to the light. You reach up and pull the hood back into place without thinking about it. The movement is automatic and unremarkable as the movement of the bee that lands on the back of your hand for just a moment before deciding that you are not a flower and lifting off again to search for something more promising. The weight of the wool is familiar and comforting, and it settles around your head and shoulders like a second skin that has been shaped by years of wear and years of washing in the cold water of the well, and years of drying in the same sun that now warms it. You turn away from the skeps and you walk slowly back along the stone path toward the small wooden bench that sits under the pear tree, and you sit down on the bench with the same slow, careful motion that you use for everything else, lowering yourself onto the weathered planks and feeling the way the wood gives slightly under your weight, and then settles into place as if it has been expecting you and is glad to have you there. The bench is old, and the ends of the planks are worn smooth and rounded where countless hands have rested on them over the years. And there is a groove in the middle of the seat where the bodies of the brothers who have sat here before you have pressed into the wood and left behind a kind of memory that is not written in words, but is written in the shape of the grain and the softness of the surface. You sit and you listen to the bees and you watch the clouds move across the sky with a slowness that matches the slowness of everything else in this place. And you let your mind drift into that state of quiet awareness that is neither sleeping nor waking, but something in between, a state where thoughts come and go like the bees themselves, arriving and departing without any effort or intention on your part. The sun moves a little farther across the sky, and the shadow of the pear tree shifts on the stones, and you do not move because there is no need to move and no place that you would rather be than here in this garden where the sound of the bees is the only music, and the distant thunder is only a reminder of how far away the world is and how solid the walls are that keep it out. The walls are made of the same pale limestone that forms the bones of the hills and the cliffs that rise up behind the monastery, and they have been standing for so long that they have become part of the landscape rather than something that was built upon it. Moss grows in the cracks between the stones, and small ferns have found footholds in the places where the mortar has crumbled away, and there are snails that leave their silver trails across the surface of the rock in the early morning when the dew is still heavy, and the world is still heavy, and the world is still and silent except for the first stirrings of the bees as the warmth of the day begins to reach into their skeps and wake them from their overnight rest. You have seen those snails many times, and you have watched them move with a slowness that makes the movements of the bees seem frantic by comparison. And you have often thought that the snails understand something about time that the rest of the world has forgotten, something about the way that the hours stretch out and become elastic, when there is nothing to do but move from one leaf to the next and leave behind a trace of your passage that will be gone by midday when the sun has dried the stone and the silver trail has faded into the grey of the rock. The thunder sounds again, and it is fainter this time, and you realize that the storm, whatever it is and wherever it is moving away from the valley and taking its noise with it to some other place where other people will hear it and perhaps look up from their work and wonder if rain is coming. And you do not wonder, because rain is not coming here today, and the sky above the garden is still the deep, untroubled blue of a bowl that has been turned upside down over the earth, and sealed at the deep, untroubled blue of a bowl that has been turned upside down over the earth and sealed at the edges by the line of the hills. A butterfly passes in front of you, a small white one with faint grey markings on the edges of its wings, and it flutters in the direction of the lavender and lands on a stalk that bends under its negligible weight and then springs back slightly as the butterfly takes off again and heads toward the well, where there is a small puddle of water that has formed on the wooden cover from the bucket that dripped there this morning. The butterfly lands on the edge of the puddle and extends its long coiled tongue to drink from the surface of the water, and you watch it, and you feel the weight of your own eyelids beginning to grow heavy with the warmth and the hum and the peace of the garden that asks nothing of you except that you be present and still and willing to let the day unfold at its own pace, without any interference or direction from you. This is the first hour of the day in the walled garden, and it is an hour that contains nothing of importance and everything of value, an hour that will be followed by other hours that are almost exactly the same, except for the small changes in the light and the angle of the shadows and the particular tasks that you will perform, with the same slow, careful attention that you bring to everything you do. The smoker is waiting for you in the tool shed, and the skips will need to be checked, and the grass that grows between the stones will need to be pulled, and the well bucket will need to be lowered again, to water the young plants that are just beginning to push their way up through the dark soil of the vegetable patch on the other side of the garden. But none of that needs to be done right now. And there is no hurry and no schedule that cannot be adjusted to accommodate the simple pleasure of sitting on a wooden bench under a pear tree and listening to the bees and the fading echo of the Symbolestein of taste. You close your eyes for a moment and you let the sounds of the garden wash over you like water. The drone of the bees and the rustle of the leaves and the distant call of a bird that you cannot name, and you feel yourself sinking a little deeper into the bench, and a little deeper into the bench, and a little deeper into the die, and a little deeper into the life that you have chosen, and that has chosen you in return, a life of straw and wax, and the slow, sweet labour of caring for creatures that ask nothing more than a safe place to be clays. The morning begins not with a sound, but with a quality of light that seeps through the narrow window of your small cell and paints a pale rectangle on the opposite wall. A rectangle that shifts so slowly that you cannot see it moving even if you watch it for a long time, with eyes that are still heavy and blurred from sleep. The light is grey at first, and then it warms into a soft gold that tells you the sun has cleared the low ridge to the east and is now spilling over the tiles of the monastery roof and into the garden where the bees are already beginning to stir inside their straw domes. You rise from the narrow bed and your feet find the cool surface of the stone floor without any need for thought or direction, the same way they have found it every morning for more years than you have bothered to count. And you stand for a moment in the center of the room with your hands at your sides and your breathing slow and even while the rest of your body wakes up one part at a time. The room is small and contains only the bed and the wooden stool and a peg on the wall where your second robe hangs, and there is a small wooden cross above the door that you touch with the tips of your fingers as you pass beneath it on your way out into the corridor that leads to the garden. The corridor is dark and narrow, and the stones of the floor are worn into a shallow depression that runs down the center, where generations of sandaled feet have shuffled back and forth between the chapel and the refectory and the garden door, and your own feet find that depression without looking and follow it to the heavy door at the end, where the iron latch is cold and rough under your palm. You lift the latch and push the door open and step out into the world that is waiting for you, with the same patient stillness that it has held through all the hours of the night while you were sleeping and dreaming of things that you cannot remember now and will not try to remember, because dreams are like the mist that rises from the meadow before dawn, and they fade into nothing as soon as the sun touches them. The garden greets you with a wash of cool air that smells of wet earth and green things, and the faint, clean scent of the rosemary that has been brushed by the passage of some small animal during the night. The sky above the walls is the color of a pearl that has been held under water, pale and luminous, and streaked with the last traces of pink that are already fading into the blue that will dominate the rest of the day. Your bare feet touch the stone path, and the stones are cold and slick with the dew that has settled on every surface during the hours of darkness, and you feel the dampness climbing up through the soles of your feet and into your ankles. And you do not hurry because there is no reason to hurry, and the cold is not unpleasant, but rather a kind of gentle awakening that tells your body it is time to be present and alert, and ready for the small tasks that lie ahead. The bees are not yet flying in great numbers because the air is still too cool for their wings to work at full speed. But you can hear a few of them already at the entrances of the skeps, crawling out onto the landing boards and pausing there as if they are testing the temperature with their antennae and deciding whether the world is warm enough yet to justify the effort of flight. One of them takes off and rises a few inches into the air and then settles back down onto the straw and begins to groom its face with its front legs. And you watch this small act of preparation, and you feel a kinship with the creature because you too are preparing yourself for the work of the day. And the first step of that preparation is the lighting of the smoker. The smoker lives in the tool shed that is built against the north wall of the garden, where the shadow lingers longest, and the stone stays cool even in the heat of the afternoon. And you walk toward it now with your feet leaving dark prints on the grey stones where the dew has been disturbed by your passage. The shed is a simple structure made of the same pale limestone as the walls and roofed with curved clay tiles that have turned dark with age and moss, and the wooden door hangs on leather hinges that creak in a way that is familiar and comforting because it is the same creak that you have heard every morning for as long as you have been the keeper of the bees. You pull the door open and the smell of the shed washes over you, a smell of old straw and dry wood, and the sharp, resinous scent of the pine needles that you gathered last autumn and stored in a sack in the corner for exactly this purpose. The smoker hangs from a peg on the wall next to a bundle of dried lavender stems and a small clay pot that holds a piece of flint and a curved piece of steel that fits into your palm as if it was made for your hand. and your hand alone. You take the smoker down from its peg and you hold it for a moment, feeling the weight of it and the way the metal of the bellows has been worn smooth by the pressure of your thumb and the way the leather of the bellows has softened and darkened with use and with the oil from your skin. The smoker is a simple thing in its design, a cylinder of tin with a hinged lid and a spout that curves upward and outward like the neck of a goose, and attached to the back of it is a pair of small bellows that you squeeze to push air through the burning fuel inside and send the white smoke puffing out in a gentle, steady stream that calms the bees without harming them or driving them away. You understand the smoke in a way that you do not understand many other things in the world, and you know that it does not frighten the bees, but rather speaks to them in a language that is older than words and tells them that there is no danger here, and that they should be still and patient while the hands of the keeper move among them and do the work that must be done for the health of the hive and the continuation of the small perfect society that they have built inside the darkness of the skep. You carry the smoker out of the shed and you set it down on the flat stone that serves as a doorstep, and then you go back inside to gather the things that you will need to wake it from its overnight sleep and bring it to life for the day ahead. The sack of pine needles is in the corner, and you reach into it and take a handful of the dry brown needles that crackle softly in your grip and release their sharp scent into the air around you, a scent that reminds you of the forest that lies beyond the monastery lands and the way the ground there is carpeted with a thick layer of needles that muffles every footstep and makes the world seem softer and quieter than it is anywhere else. You put the pine needles into the body of the smoker and you tamp them down gently with your fingers, not too tightly because the fire needs air to breathe, and you have learned over the years exactly how much space to leave between the strands of fuel so that it will catch quickly and burn slowly and produce the kind of thick white smoke that the bees prefer. On top of the pine needles you place a small handful of dried herbs that you have gathered from the garden itself, a mixture of rosemary and lavender and a few leaves of sage that have been hanging from the rafters of the shed since last summer and are now so dry that they crumble into dust when you rub them between your fingers. The herbs are not necessary for the function of the smoker, but you add them anyway because you like the way they smell when they burn, and you believe, without any evidence or need for evidence, that the bees like it too, and that the familiar scent of the garden carried on the smoke tells them that everything is as it should be, and that the hands that move among them are the same hands that planted the lavender and watered the rosemary and tended the skeps through all the seasons that have come and gone. You close the lid of the smoker, and you pick up the flint and the steel, and you kneel down on the doorstep with the smoker in front of you, and you begin the slow, patient work of striking a spark into the small pile of dry tinder that you have placed just inside the opening of the spout. The first strike produces nothing but a brief flash of light and a faint smell of hot metal, and you adjust your grip on the steel and try again, and this time a small orange spark jumps from the flint and lands on the edge of the pine needles and sits there for a moment, glowing and then fading, and you lean forward and blow gently across the surface of the fuel with a breath that is slow and steady and full of the same patience that you bring to everything you do in this garden. The spark catches and a tiny flame appears, no larger than the tip of your smallest finger, and it spreads slowly through the pine needles and begins to send up a thin ribbon of pale smoke that curls out of the spout and rises into the cool morning air and disappears against the brightness of the sky. You squeeze the bellows once, and the flame brightens and the smoke thickens and becomes the rich white plume that you have been waiting for, and you squeeze again and watch the smoke billow out and drift across the stones of the path and wrap itself around the base of the nearest skep as if it is greeting the bees and telling them that the day has begun and the keeper is here and all is well. You stand up slowly and your knees make a small sound of protest that you ignore because it is the same sound they have made every morning for years, and it means nothing except that you are no longer young in the way that the novices are young, and that your body remembers every morning of kneeling on the cold stones and striking sparks from the flint and tending to the small fires that keep the bees calm and the honey flowing. You pick up the smoker by its wooden handle and you feel the warmth of the metals spreading through the wood and into your palm, and you begin to walk toward the skeps with the same slow, measured pace that you use for everything. A pace that is not slow because you are tired or reluctant, but slow because you are tired or reluctant. But slow because there is no reason to hurry, and because the bees can sense haste and they do not like it. And they will tell you so in their own way if you approach them too quickly or with too much purpose in your stride. The dew is still heavy on the grass that grows between the stones, and on the leaves of the lavender, and on the domed tops of the skeps themselves. And the drops of water catch the light of the morning sun and turn into tiny points of gold and silver that shimmer and shift as you move past them, and the air you displace causes the stems to tremble and the drops to fall and splash onto the stones below. Your robe brushes against the wet leaves and the hem grows dark with moisture that will dry slowly over the course of the morning until there is no sign left that the dew was ever there at all. And you think about this cycle of wetting and drying, and you find it comforting in the same way that you find the cycle of the bees' lives comforting, and the cycle of the bees' lives comforting, and the cycle of your own days comforting. Because they all follow a pattern, the bees' lives, but the bees, the peas, the peas. You reach the first skep and you stop a few feet away from the entrance where a small cluster of bees has gathered on the landing board and is waiting for the warmth of the day to reach the point where flight becomes easy and the work of gathering can begin. You lift the smoker and you point the spout toward the entrance and you squeeze the bellows once, twice, 3 times, sending 3 gentle puffs of white smoke into the opening and watching as the smoke curls inward and disappears into the darkness where the queen is waiting and the workers are tinting the brood, and the whole intricate machinery of the hive is ticking away in the warm, fragrant dark. The bees on the landing board react to the smoke in the way that they always do, which is to say that they do not react very much at all, but rather become a little slower and a little calmer and a little more inclined to stay where they are and groom their wings and wait for the signal that the danger, if there was any danger, has passed. You watch them for a moment and you see one of them turn and crawl back into the entrance, and you know that it is carrying the news of the smoke to the others inside, and that the hive is already beginning to settle into the quiet, receptive state that you need if you're going to lift the skep and check the combs and see how the colony is faring in these early weeks of summer. But you do not lift the skep now because it is still too early, and the air is still too cool, and the bees are still too sluggish to be disturbed in any meaningful way. And you know that the best time for working with the hives is later in the morning when the sun has warmed the straw and the bees have mostly left to forage, and the ones that remain are the young ones and the guard bees, and the queen herself, who never leaves the darkness of her chamber except on those rare and momentous days when the hive grows too crowded and those days are still far off, and there is no sign of them yet in the steady, unhurried rhythm of the hives. And so you move on to the next skep and you give it the same 3 puffs of smoke and you receive the same calm, slow response. And then you move on to the next and the next until you have visited all 7 of the skeps. And the garden is filled with the sweet, acrid smell of the smoker, and the bees are quiet and content and ready for whatever small intrusions the day may bring. The walk back to the shed is slower than the walk out, because the smoker is heavier now, with the weight of the burning fuel, and the heat of the metal has begun to seep through the wooden handle and warm your palm in a way that is almost uncomfortable, but not quite. And you shift your grip and carry it a little farther from your body and feel the heat radiating against the side of your face as you walk. The sun is higher now, and the dew is beginning to lift from the grass and the leaves, rising as a faint mist that hangs just above the ground and catches the light and turns the garden into a place that seems to exist somewhere between the earth and the sky, and not quite fully in either. You reach the shed, and you set the smoker down on the doorstep again, and you open the lid carefully because the metal is hot, and you have learned through painful experience that hot metal and bare skin are not good companions. And you peer inside to see how the fuel is burning and whether you need to add more pine needles, or whether the current load will last through the morning's work. The fire is burning well, a steady glow of orange and red that pulses gently when you squeeze the bellows and settles back into its steady consumption of the needles and the herbs when you release them. And you decide that it will last, and you close the lid and you leave the smoker on the doorstep, where it will continue to send up its thin ribbon of smoke and scent, the air with the smell of pine and rosemary, and the quiet promise of the work that lies ahead. You turn away from the shed, and you walk to the well and you lower the bucket into the darkness, and you hear the splash when it meets the surface of the water far below, and you wait for a moment to let it fill, and then you pull it up hand over hand with the rope that is rough and damp and familiar in your grip. The bucket comes up dripping and cold, and you set it on the stone rim of the well, and you cup your hands, and you drink the water that tastes of stone and depth, and the long, slow journey it has made through the limestone of the hills before it reached this place, and this bucket and this morning. The water is cold, and it clears the last of the sleep from your throat, and you stand there for a moment with your hands resting on the rim of the well, and your eyes looking out across the garden at the skeps that are now beginning to stir with the first real activity of the day, as the sun warms the straw and the bees decide that the time for waiting is over and the time for flying has begun. A steady stream of them is emerging from each entrance now, launching themselves into the air and climbing upward, and then turning toward the meadows and the fields and the wild places where the clover is blooming, and the thyme is opening its small pink flowers to the sky, and the linden trees are beginning to release their heavy honeyed scent into the warm air of early summer. You watch them go and you feel a kind of quiet satisfaction that is too deep and too familiar to be called happiness, but is something close to it, something like the feeling of a stone that has been worn smooth by the river and now rests in a place where the current is slow and the sun is warm and nothing is required of it except to be still and to be present and to let the water flow around it and over it without resistance or complaint. This is the morning ritual of the smoker and the slow walk across the dew, and it is a ritual that will be repeated tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as there are bees in the skeps and a keeper to tend them, and a garden that holds them all in its quiet green embrace, while the world beyond the walls goes about its own business, in ways that you do not understand and do not need to understand, because your business is here, with the straw and the smoke and the small humming that depend on the steadiness of your heart. The skeps stand in their gentle curve along the base of the south wall, where the limestone blocks have absorbed the warmth of the morning and are now beginning to radiate it back into the air, creating a small zone of comfort that the bees seem to appreciate, even if they have no words to express their appreciation. There are 7 of them, and each one is slightly different from the others, in ways that are not immediately visible to someone who has not spent many hours sitting on the wooden bench and watching the light move across their domed surfaces, and the shadows shift in the hollows of their coiled sides. You know these differences the way you know the faces of the brothers who sit beside you in the chapel, not by any single feature, but by the accumulation of small details that add up to a complete and familiar whole. The skep nearest the pear tree is the oldest, and its straw has darkened to the color of strong tea that has been steeping for a long time, while the skep at the far end of the curve was built only 3 summers ago and still retains the pale golden hue of the fresh rye straw that you gathered from the fields beyond the monastery walls, and dried in the sun and stored in the shed until the day came when you needed it. The other 5 fall somewhere between these 2 extremes, their colors ranging from honey to amber to the deep brown of fallen oak leaves, and each color tells a story about the age of the skep and the weather it has endured, and the way the hands of the keeper have shaped and reshaped the coils over the course of many seasons. To understand the skep is to understand the straw, and the way it bends, and the way it holds its shape when it is twisted and bound and pressed into the service of housing a colony of bees. The straw comes from the rye that grows in the long field that slopes down from the monastery toward the stream, where the willows lean over the water and trail their thin branches in the current. You have walked that field many times in the late summer when the rye is tall and golden and the heads of grain are heavy and nodding in the breeze that comes up from the valley, and you have watched the brothers cut the stalks with their curved sickles and bind them into sheaves and carry them to the threshing floor, where the grain is separated from the straw and the chaff rises in a pale cloud that hangs in the air and catches the sunlight and makes everyone who works there sneeze and rub their eyes. The straw that is left behind after the grain has been beaten free is not waste, but rather the raw material from which the skeps are made, and you have learned over the years to select only the best stalks for this purpose, the ones that are long and straight and free of the dark spots that indicate rot or the weakness that comes from growing too quickly in soil that is too rich and too wet. The best straw for skep making comes from rye that is grown slowly in thin soil on a south-facing slope where the roots have to reach deep to find water, and the stalks develop a toughness and a flexibility that is exactly what is needed for the work of coiling and binding. You gather the selected stalks, and you store them in the shed where they dry further over the winter and become even more pliable and even more willing to take on the shape that you will ask of them when the spring comes and the new swarms are looking for homes and the old skeps need to be repaired or replaced. The making of a skep begins not with the straw, but with a length of twisted willow bark that has been soaked in water until it is soft and supple and can be tied into a tight knot without cracking or breaking. You have a bundle of these willow withies hanging from a peg in the shed, and they are the same color as the straw itself. A pale brown that darkens with age and exposure to the air and the smoke and the propolis that the bees spread over every surface of their home as a kind of varnish that seals the cracks and keeps out the damp and the drafts. The first step is to take a handful of straw and form it into a tight bundle that is about the thickness of your wrist, and then to bend it into a circle and bind it with the willow bark so that it holds its shape and becomes the foundation upon which the rest of the skep will be built. This foundation ring is the most important part of the whole structure because everything else depends on it being true and round and strong, and you spend more time on this first ring than on any other single part of the process, turning it in your hands and checking it against the light and adjusting the tension of the bindings until it is as close to perfect as anything made by human hands and natural materials can ever be. When the foundation ring is finished, you set it aside and you begin the long, slow work of coiling the rest of the skep, a process that is so repetitive and so meditative that it becomes a kind of prayer in itself, a prayer made not of words but of the steady rhythm of the hands and the rustle of the straw and the soft creak of the willow bark as it is pulled tight around each new layer. You take another handful of straw and you press it against the foundation ring and you begin to wrap it with the willow bark, not in a spiral that climbs upward all at once, but in a series of overlapping coils that build upon each other like the courses of stone in the monastery walls or the layers of sediment in the cliffs above the river. Each coil is pressed tightly against the one below it and bound in place with the bark that you wind round and around and through and through and through, pulling it snug but not too tight, because the straw needs room to breathe and to flex and to settle into its final shape over time. The geometry of the skep is not the sharp but precise geometry of the cathedrals that men build to glorify something greater than themselves, but rather the soft, organic geometry of the natural world where circles are never perfect and lines are never straight and everything curves and bends and accommodates itself to the materials from which it is made. The dome rises slowly from the foundation ring and you watch it grow with each new coil, shaping it with your hands as it rises and making small adjustments to the tension of the bark and the thickness of the straw so that the walls are even and the curve is smooth, and the final shape will be one that sheds the rain and holds the warmth and provides the bees with the dark, secure space they need to build their combs and raise their young and store the honey that will sustain them through the winter. The entrance is formed not by cutting a hole in the finished skep, but by leaving a gap in the coiling at the right moment, a small archway near the bottom where the bees will come and go, and where you will place the small wooden landing board that gives them a place to rest before they launch themselves into the air or after they return heavy with pollen and nectar and the exhaustion of a long day's flight. The landing board is a simple piece of wood that you shaped with a knife until it is smooth and flat and fits snugly into the gap in the straw, and you secure it with extra bindings of willow bark that wrap around the board and the adjacent coils and hold everything together in a way that is both strong and gentle. The interior of the skep is a mystery that you will never fully see, because to open it completely would be to destroy the home that you have built and to disrupt the lives of the bees in a way that is never necessary and always to be avoided. You know what is inside only from the glimpses you get when you lift the skep gently from its base and peer up into the darkness and see the edges of the combs hanging down like curtains made of wax and honey, and the small pale bodies of the bees that are clinging to them and tending to the brood and doing the 1,000 small tasks that keep the hive alive and functioning. The combs themselves are a kind of geometry that is far more perfect than anything you could ever create with straw and bark, a geometry of hexagons that fit together without gaps or waste, and that use the least possible amount of wax to hold the greatest possible amount of honey. You have marveled at this geometry many times, and you have never stopped marveling at it, not because it is new or surprising, but because it is so old and so reliable and so perfectly suited to its purpose that it seems to have existed before the bees themselves and to have been waiting for them to arrive and give it form. The bees build their combs from the top down, and they attach them to the underside of the dome, where the straw provides a rough surface for the wax to grip. And as the colony grows and the combs lengthen, they fill the interior of the skep with a dense, living architecture that is both fragile and strong, and that pulses with the warmth of 10,000 small bodies moving and breathing and working in the dark. The outside of the skep is not left bare to the weather, because the rain would eventually soak through the straw and chill the bees and cause the combs to grow moldy and the colony to sicken and die. You protect each skep with a thick layer of thatch that is made from the same rye straw, but arranged differently, laid over the dome in overlapping layers that shed the water and direct it down and away from the entrance and the base. The thatch is tied down with more willow bark and with wooden pegs that you carve from the branches of the pear tree and sharpen to a point and drive into the straw with a wooden mallet that has been in the shed for longer than anyone can remember. The mallet is made of a dense, dark wood that is heavy in the hand and polished smooth by use, and the head of it is slightly flattened on one side where it has struck against the pegs and the straw, and the hard surface of the ground over countless seasons of repair and renewal. You know the weight of that mallet, and you know the sound it makes when it strikes the peg, a dull thud that is absorbed by the straw and the earth, and does not echo or disturb the bees or the quiet of the garden. The finished skep with its fresh thatch looks like a small round house that has been tucked into the corner of the garden to wait for its inhabitants. And when the swarm arrives and settles into the darkness inside and begins to build its combs and lay its eggs and store its honey, the skep becomes something more than a house. It becomes a living thing itself, a body that contains other bodies, a structure that is both shelter and sustainer, and that will stand in its place against the wall through the heat of summer and the cold of winter and the winds of spring and the rains of autumn until the straw finally weakens and the thins and the time comes to build a new one, and retire the old to the pile behind the shed, where it will slowly return to the earth from which it came. You walk among the skeps now in the growing warmth of the morning, and you run your hand over the surface of the nearest one, feeling the rough texture of the straw and the smooth patches where the bees have coated the outside with propolis that they have gathered from the buds of trees, and the cracks in the bark and carried home on their legs to use as glue and sealant and medicine. The propolis is sticky and dark, and it has a smell that is sharp and resinous and completely unlike anything else in the garden, a smell that speaks of forests and tree sap and the deep ancient relationship between the bees and the plants that sustain them. Your fingers find a spot where the thatch has loosened over the winter, and you make a mental note to bring a length of willow bark and a wooden peg when you return later in the day to do the more active work of tending the hives. This is how the work goes in the garden, a constant cycle of small observations and small repairs that add up over time to a kind of maintenance that is never finished and never urgent and never demanding more than you can give in any single moment. You move to the next skep, and you notice that the landing board on this one is slightly askew and has been pushed outward by the growth of the colony inside, and you press it gently back into place with your thumb and feel it settle into the straw and hold there without any need for additional binding. The bees coming and going do not seem to notice your hand or your adjustment, and they continue their steady traffic in and out of the entrance, some of them carrying bright loads of yellow pollen on their legs, and others carrying nothing visible but the energy and purpose that drives them out into the world and back again. The geometry of the straw coils is most visible on the underside of the skep, where the weight of the structure presses down and the individual strands of straw are flattened and compressed into a dense, layered pattern that resembles the grain of wood or the flow of water over stone. You have lifted the skeps many times, and you have seen these patterns, and you have found them beautiful, in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not spent many hours with their hands in the straw and their eyes on the slow, patient work of coiling and binding. The patterns are not planned, and they are not the result of any conscious effort on your part, but rather emerge from the nature of the materials themselves, and the way they respond to the pressure of your hands, and the tension of the bindings, and the weight of the structure that grows above them. Each skep has its own unique pattern, and you could probably identify each one by its underside alone if you were ever asked to do so, though no one has ever asked and no one ever will, because the skeps are not objects of study or admiration, but simply the homes of the bees and the focus of your daily labor. You lower yourself to your knees on the stone path, and you lean forward, and you look at the entrance of the nearest skep from a level that is closer to the level of the bees themselves, and you watch the way they navigate the small space of the opening with a precision that is both instinctive and learned, and that never fails to impress you with its quiet efficiency. The bees do not bump into each other, and they do not hesitate, and they do not seem to experience any of the confusion or uncertainty that plagues human beings when they are faced with a crowded doorway and a pressing need to be on the other side of it. They simply move through the space as if it was made for them, which of course it was, and they do so without any apparent effort or awareness that what they are doing is remarkable in any way. The straw that forms the walls of the skep is not a perfect insulator, but it is good enough, and you have learned over the years that the bees themselves are the best regulators of the temperature inside their home. In the summer they fan their wings at the entrance to draw cool air through the hive and evaporate the moisture from the nectar that they are turning into honey, and in the winter they cluster together in a tight ball around the queen and shiver their flight muscles to generate heat and keep the center of the cluster warm enough to survive even the coldest nights. The straw holds some of that heat and blocks some of the wind and provides a buffer between the delicate internal climate of the hive and the harsh external climate of the world, and this is all that is asked of it and all that is needed. You think about this as you kneel on the stones and watch the bees and feel the sun warming the back of your neck and your shoulders through the wool of your robe, and you realize that the skep is not so different from your own robe in its function and its relationship to the body it contains. Both are made of natural materials that have been shaped by human hands, and both serve to protect and to comfort and to provide a boundary between the vulnerable interior and the unpredictable exterior. And both will eventually wear out and return to the earth and be replaced by something new that is made of the same materials and shaped by the same hands and destined for the same slow, patient cycle of use and decay and renewal. You rise from your knees and you brush the small bits of straw and dirt from the front of your robe, and you stand for a moment longer in the curve of the skeps, listening to the sound of the bees and the sound of the wind in the pear tree and the sound of the distant thunder that has returned to the northern horizon and is rumbling there like a reminder of something that you do not need to remember. The garden is full of geometry, if you look for it. The geometry of the skeps and the cones and the hexagons of the honeycomb and the spirals of the snail shells and the radial symmetry of the flowers that open their faces to the sun. But it is a quiet geometry, and it does not demand to be noticed or understood or measured, and you are content to let it be what it is, without analysis or interpretation. Content to stand among the skeps and feel the straw under your palm and the sun on your back, and the slow, steady passage of a day that is no different from any other day and yet is entirely its own and will never come again. The weather of early June in this part of France is a thing that arrives without announcement and settles over the valley like a warm, heavy blanket that has been pulled from a chest where it has been stored with sprigs of lavender to keep the moths away. You have known this weather before, and you will know it again, and there is nothing in it that surprises you or asks you to change the rhythm of your days in any significant way. The mornings begin cool and damp with a mist that rises from the meadow and hangs just above the surface of the grass until the sun climbs high enough to burn it away. And during those first hours, the air has a freshness to it that reminds you of spring, even though the calendar has turned, and the longest day of the year is now only a few weeks away. You like the mornings best, you think, though you have never tried to rank the hours of the day in any formal way, and you suspect that if you were asked to choose, you would find something to recommend each of them. The afternoon brings a heat that builds slowly and steadily, and presses down on the garden with a weight that is not unpleasant, but is simply present, like the weight of your own hand resting on your knee when you sit on the wooden bench and watch the bees. And the evening cools again, with a suddenness that sometimes catches you unaware, and sends you back to the shed to retrieve the smoker or a tool that you left behind. And the stones under your bare feet are still warm from the sun that has been soaking into them all day, and they release that warmth into the soles of your feet as you walk, and you are grateful for it. The sky in early June is a particular shade of blue that you have tried to describe to yourself on several occasions and have never quite succeeded in capturing with words. It is not the pale, washed blue of winter or the deep, intense blue of high summer, but something in between. A blue that has a little bit of white mixed into it, and a little bit of grey at the edges where the heat haze softens the line between the earth and the heavens. Clouds move across this blue with a slowness that matches the slowness of everything else in the garden, and they are the kind of clouds that do not threaten rain, but merely decorate the sky and provide a shifting pattern of light and shadow on the ground below. You watch them sometimes when you are sitting on the bench and your hands are idle, and your mind is drifting, and you see shapes in them that remind you of things you have known and things you have only imagined. A bear and a fish and a cart with a broken wheel and the profile of an old man with a long beard that trails off into wisps of vapor and disappears, The shapes do not last, and you do not try to hold on to them, and this is part of the contentment that the weather of early June brings with it, the understanding that nothing is meant to last, and that the beauty of a thing is often tied to its impermanence and its willingness to change into something else without resistance or regret. The worker bees understand this in their own way, or at least they live as if they understand it, and their contentment is not the contentment of idleness, but the contentment of purpose fulfilled and labor completed, and the steady, unremarkable satisfaction of doing exactly what one was made to do. You have watched them for so many hours and so many days and so many seasons that you feel you know them in a way that you have never known another human being, not because they are simple or easy to understand, but because they are consistent, and because they do not hide their nature behind words or intentions or the complicated machinery of human consciousness. A worker bee that emerges from her cell in the early summer knows without being taught what her tasks will be and in what order she will perform them, beginning with the cleaning of the cells and the tending of the brood, and then progressing to the building of the comb and the receiving of the nectar from the foragers, and finally, when she is older and her wings are strong and her sense of direction is fully developed, to the long flights out into the world to gather the pollen and the nectar and the propolis that the hive requires. You have seen the young bees standing at the entrance and fanning their wings to circulate the air, and you have seen the older bees returning with their bodies heavy and their movements slow and deliberate, and you have seen them all working together in a harmony that requires no discussion or debate or compromise, because each one knows her place and her purpose and the exact moment when her purpose will change and her place will be taken by another. The contentment of the worker bees is most visible on a day like today, when the weather is warm but not hot, and the sky is clear but not empty, and the flowers in the meadow and the hedgerows are opening their petals and offering their nectar to any creature that is willing to carry their pollen from one bloom to another. You can see it in the way they move through the air without hurry or hesitation, tracing routes that are invisible to you, but are as real and as familiar to them as the path from your cell to the garden is to you. A bee leaves the entrance and rises into the air and circles once to orient herself, and then sets off in a straight line toward the span of linden trees that grows along the edge of the stream, and you watch her go until she is too small to see and has merged with the blue of the sky, and the green of the leaves and the general hum of the garden that fills your ears and your mind. Another bee arrives from the opposite direction and lands on the landing board and pauses there for a moment to rest and to groom her wings and to adjust the load of bright orange pollen that is packed into the baskets on her hind legs. And then she walks into the darkness of the entrance and disappears and is replaced almost immediately by another bee who is just leaving and who passes her in the narrow opening with a small sideways movement that seems almost polite in its deference. The traffic never stops, and it never speeds up and it never slows down, and this constancy is another form of contentment, the contentment of a rhythm that has been established over millions of years and that will continue for millions more, regardless of what happens in the world of men beyond the walls. The air itself seems content on a day like this, and it moves through the garden with a gentleness that barely stirs the leaves of the pear tree and barely ruffles the surface of the water in the well bucket and barely touches your face as you stand in the curve of the skeps and watch the bees and listen to the distant thunder that has become so familiar that you no longer notice it unless you make a conscious effort to do so. The thunder is there, and then it is not there, and then it is there again. A low rumble that rolls across the northern horizon and fades into the sound of the bees and the wind and the small rustlings of the garden creatures that go about their own business in the shadows and the undergrowth. You have learned to live with the thunder in the same way that you have learned to live with the heat of the afternoon and the cool of the evening and the slow, patient work of tending the skeps and repairing the thatch and harvesting the honey when the time comes. It is simply part of the background of your life, and it asks nothing of you, and you give it nothing in return except the occasional moment of awareness when a particularly loud roll causes you to lift your head and look toward the north and see the thin line of grey cloud that sits on the horizon like a smudge of ash, and then return your attention to the things that are immediately before you and within your power to effect. The flowers that feed the bees in early June are numerous and varied, and you have learned to recognize them all by sight and by scent, and by the way the bees behave when they are working among them. The clover is the most reliable and the most abundant, and it grows in the meadow in great patches of pink and white that hum with the sound of bees from dawn until dusk, and the honey that comes from the clover is pale and sweet, and has a mildness that makes it suitable for the table of the abbot and the infirmary where the sick brothers are given small spoons of it, to strengthen their bodies and soothe their throats. The thyme grows wild on the rocky slopes above the monastery, and it blooms in tiny purple flowers that are so small you can barely see them unless you kneel down and bring your face close to the ground. But the bees find them without any difficulty, and they return from the thyme patches with a dusting of pale pollen on their faces, and a look of particular satisfaction that you have learned to recognize over the years. The lavender in the garden itself is just beginning to open, and the bees are paying it a great deal of attention, landing on the slender stalks and crawling up toward the purple buds and probing them with their long tongues to extract the nectar that is hidden deep inside. You have stood and watched them on the lavender many times, and you have noticed that they seem to prefer the flowers that are in full sun, and that they will ignore the ones that are in shade until the sun has moved and the shadow has shifted and the flower has been warmed by the light. This is not a preference that they have learned, but rather a knowledge that is built into their bodies and their instincts, a knowledge that the warm flowers yield more nectar, and that the nectar is easier to gather when the sun has thinned it and made it flow more freely. The linden trees along the stream are the great prize of early summer, and when they bloom the air for a mile in every direction is filled with a scent that is so sweet and so heavy that you can almost taste it on your tongue. The bees go to the lindens in great numbers, and they return with their bodies coated in a fine yellow dust and their honey stomachs full of the clear, fragrant nectar that will be transformed over the course of several days into a honey that is dark and rich and has a slight minty undertone that lingers on the palate long after the sweetness has faded. You have tasted this honey many times, and you have always been struck by the way it captures the essence of the linden flowers and preserves it in a form that can be enjoyed months later when the trees are bare and the stream is cold, and the memory of summer is something that must be conjured from the warmth of the fire and the taste of the honey on a piece of dark bread. The bees do not know that they are preserving the summer, and they do not care. And this is another aspect of their contentment that you find yourself envying in a quiet, uncomplicated way. They do the work because the work is there to be done, and because their bodies and their instincts compel them to do it, and they do not worry about the future or regret the past or wonder if the honey they are making will be taken from them by the hands of the keeper when the autumn comes and the harvest begins. They simply fly and gather and build and tend and live out their brief purposeful lives in the warmth of the hive and the light of the sun, and when they die they are carried away by their sisters and dropped outside the entrance where their bodies will dry and crumble and return to the earth that grew the flowers that fed them. The heat of the afternoon builds slowly, and the garden becomes a place of stillness and shadow and the quiet, persistent hum of the bees that seems to come from everywhere at once and from nowhere in particular. You have moved the wooden bench into the shade of the pear tree, and you are sitting there now with your hands resting on your knees and your eyes half closed against the brightness of the sun that filters through the leaves and makes shifting patterns of light and dark on the stones at your feet. The bees are still flying, and the sound of them is a constant presence that fills your ears and your mind and leaves no room for thoughts that are not directly related to the garden and the skeps and the slow, patient work of the day. You think about the smoker and whether you should add more pine needles before the afternoon is over, and you decide that the current load will last until evening and that there is no need to disturb the slow burn that is happening inside the tin cylinder on the doorstep of the shed. You think about the skep with the loose thatch, and you make a mental note to gather a length of willow bark from the bundle in the shed, and to carve a fresh peg from the branch of the pear tree that you pruned last winter and left to dry in the corner. You think about the honey that is being made inside the dark domes of the skeps, and you wonder how much there will be when the time comes to lift the thatch and cut the combs and let the golden liquid flow into the clay pots that are stored in the cool darkness of the cellar beneath the monastery. These thoughts are not urgent, and they do not demand action or resolution, and they drift through your mind like the clouds drift across the sky, and they leave no trace behind them except a general sense of peace and a quiet anticipation of the work that lies ahead. The worker bee that lands on your hand is a small one, and she is covered in a fine dust of pale yellow pollen that rubs off onto your skin as she walks across the back of your hand and investigates the texture of your knuckles with her antennae. You do not move, and you do not flinch because you have learned over many years that the bees mean you no harm, and that they are simply curious about the large warm presence that moves among their homes and sometimes lifts the roofs from their world and exposes them to the light. The bee walks to the edge of your hand and pauses there and seems to consider the drop to the ground below, and then she turns and walks back across your knuckles and launches herself into the air and flies toward the lavender where the flowers are now fully open and the scent is rising in the warm air and mingling with the scent of the rosemary and the thyme and the clean, sharp smell of the limestone walls. You watch her go and you feel the small tickle of the pollen that she left behind on your skin. And you do not brush it away because it seems like a gift of sorts, a small reminder of the connection between your life and the lives of the bees and the flowers and the sun and the rain and the earth that holds them all in its patient, enduring embrace. The contentment of the worker bees is not something that can be explained or analyzed or reduced to a set of principles or beliefs, and you have never tried to do any of these things because you understand that some things are meant to be experienced rather than understood, and that the attempt to understand them often destroys the very thing that makes them valuable. You sit on the bench in the shade of the pear tree, and you listen to the bees, and you feel the warmth of the afternoon on your skin, and you let your mind drift into that state of quiet awareness that is neither sleeping nor waking, but something in between. A state where the boundaries between yourself and the garden and the bees and the sky become soft and blurred, and the world is simply a single, continuous experience of light and sound and warmth and peace. The thunder rolls again in the distance and you hear it, and you let it pass through you without resistance and without comment, and you return your attention to the bee that has just landed on the lavender and is probing the purple flowers with her long tongue and filling her honey stomach with the clear, sweet nectar that will become part of the honey that will sustain the hive through the winter and that you will harvest in the autumn and taste on a cold morning when the garden is bare and the skeps are lilac. And the memory of this warm adrune is something that was smumerious sufi. The flagstones beneath your feet are the same pale limestone that forms the walls and the cliffs and the bones of the hills that rise up behind the monastery, and they have been laid in the earth for so long that they have become part of the earth itself, their edges softened by the slow work of water and frost and the steady pressure of the roots that grow beneath them and around them. You have walked on these stones thousands of times, and you have never once thought about them as anything other than the ground beneath your feet, the solid and reliable surface that carries you from the door of your cell to the well, and from the well to the skeps, and from the skeps to the bench under the pear tree and back again. But if you were to stop and look down, which you do now because the afternoon is warm and your pace is slow and there is no reason not to stop and look down, you would see that the spaces between the stones are not empty, and they are not silent, and they are not the barren gaps that you might expect to find in a place where the feet of men have passed back and forth for centuries. The spaces between the stones are filled with life, small and quiet and persistent life that has found a foothold in the thin layer of soil that has accumulated over the years from the dust of the walls and the droppings of the birds and the decay of the leaves that fall from the pear tree and the lavender and the rosemary and all the other plants that grow in the garden. This soil is not deep, and it is not rich in the way that the soil of the vegetable patch is rich with the compost that you spread there every spring, and the manure that the brothers bring from the stables where the mules are kept. But it is enough, and the herbs that grow in it have learned to be content with enough, and to send their roots down into the narrow cracks, and to find the moisture that lingers there long after the surface of the stones has dried in the heat of the afternoon sun. The first herb that you notice when you look down is the wild thyme, which grows in a low mat of tiny green leaves that hug the surface of the stone and spread outward in all directions until they meet the edge of the next stone and stop because there is nowhere else to go. The leaves of the wild thyme are so small that you would need to kneel down and bring your face close to the ground to see them clearly. And if you did kneel down, you would see that each leaf is a perfect oval of deep green with a pale underside and a faint fuzz of tiny hairs that catch the light and give the plant a silvery sheen when the sun strikes it at a certain angle. The thyme blooms in early summer, and you can see the first of the flowers now, tiny pinkish-purple bells that open at the tips of the slender stems and release a scent that is so sharp and so clean and so distinctly thyme that it cuts through all the other smells of the garden and reaches your nose even from where you are standing. The bees know this scent, and they visit the thyme flowers with great enthusiasm, landing on the soft mats of leaves and crawling from one tiny blossom to the next, and probing each one with their tongues, and then taking off again with their legs dusted in the pale pollen that will feed the young bees back in the darkness of the skeps. You have watched them do this many times, and you have always been struck by the gentleness with which they treat the thyme, landing so lightly that the slender stems barely bend under their weight, and taking off again without disturbing the delicate structure of the plant in any way. The thyme has been growing between these stones for as long as anyone can remember, and it will continue to grow there long after you are gone, spreading slowly outward and filling the cracks and crevices and releasing its sharp, clean scent every time a foot steps on it, or a bee lands on it, or the hem of a robe brushes across its leaves. Next to the thyme, there is a patch of chamomile that has self-seeded from the plants that grow in the medicinal bed on the other side of the garden, and it has found a home in the gap between two stones that is slightly wider than the others and has accumulated a little more soil and a little more moisture over the years. The chamomile is taller than the thyme, and its leaves are feathery and fine, and they sway in the slightest breeze with a motion that is almost hypnotic if you watch it for long enough. The flowers of the chamomile are like tiny daisies with white petals that surround a yellow center, and they have a scent that is sweet and appley, and completely different from the sharp, herbal scent of the thyme. You know that the brothers in the infirmary value the chamomile for its calming properties, and they dry the flowers and store them in clay jars and brew them into a tea that they give to the sick and the anxious, and the ones who cannot sleep at night. You have tasted this tea yourself, on a few occasions when your own mind was restless, and the darkness of your cell seemed to press in on you, and the distant thunder from the north seemed louder than usual and more difficult to ignore. The tea is pale gold, and it tastes of honey and apples and the quiet warmth of a summer afternoon, and it does calm the mind and settle the stomach and make the darkness of the cell feel more like a shelter and less like a prison. The chamomile that grows between the stones is not harvested for the infirmary because it is too small and too scattered and too difficult to gather without damaging the plants and disturbing the delicate balance of the tiny ecosystem that exists in the cracks. It is left to grow and bloom and set its seed and die back in the autumn and return in the spring, a small and quiet reminder that some things are meant to be enjoyed where they are and not gathered and stored and used for any purpose other than the simple pleasure of seeing them there when you look down. There is a plant that you do not know the name of, a small creeping thing with round leaves that are dark green on top and purple underneath, and that spread across the surface of the stone like a stain of wine that has been spilled and left to dry. You have seen this plant in other places too, in the shady corners of the cloister and along the base of the north wall where the sun rarely reaches, and the stone stays damp and cool even in the height of summer. It does not seem to flower, or if it does, the flowers are so small and so inconspicuous that you have never noticed them, and it does not have any scent that you can detect even when you kneel down and crush a leaf between your fingers and bring it to your nose. But it is beautiful in its own quiet way, and it fills the spaces between the stones with a carpet of deep color that contrasts with the pale gray of the limestone and the bright green of the thyme and the feathery lightness of the chamomile. You do not know why this plant grows here and not in other places, and you do not know what conditions it requires or what purpose it serves in the larger scheme of the garden and the world. And this not knowing does not trouble you, because you have learned over the years that there are many things you do not know and will never know, and that the not knowing is not a failure, but simply a recognition of the limits of your own understanding and the vastness of the world that exists beyond it. The plant with the purple leaves grows between the stones, and you step over it carefully when you walk, and you do not pull it up or try to remove it, because it has as much right to be there as you do, and because the garden is not a place for imposing human order on the natural world, but a place for letting things be what they are and grow where they will. The wild strawberry is another plant that has found its way into the cracks between the stones, and it is perhaps your favorite of all the small herbs that grow there because it offers something more than scent and beauty and the quiet satisfaction of simply existing. The wild strawberry spreads by runners that creep across the surface of the stone and send down tiny roots wherever they find a crack or a crevice or a patch of soil that is deep enough to support them. The leaves are three-parted and toothed at the edges, and they are a bright, cheerful green that seems to glow in the morning light when the dew is still on them and the sun is low and golden. The flowers appear in late spring, and they are white with 5 petals and a yellow center, and they are so delicate that they seem to be made of paper or of the finest silk. And the bees visit them too, though not with the same enthusiasm that they show for the thyme and the lavender and the linden trees. The fruit comes later in the summer, tiny red berries that are no larger than the tip of your smallest finger and that hide under the leaves and are easy to miss if you're not looking for them. You have found them many times when you were kneeling on the stones to tend the skeps or to pull a weed that had grown too large and too bold, and you have picked them and eaten them and tasted the concentrated sweetness that is so much more intense than the sweetness of the large cultivated strawberries that grow in the vegetable patch and are served at the abbot's table on feast days. The wild strawberries are a gift, and they are not something that you expect or demand or feel entitled to, and this is part of what makes them so sweet when you do find them and pop them into your mouth and let the flavor spread across your tongue and remind you that the world is full of small pleasures that cost nothing and ask nothing and are simply there for anyone who is willing to slow down and look down and pay attention. The moss is not an herb in the strict sense, but it grows between the stones nonetheless, and it deserves to be mentioned in any accounting of the life that fills the cracks and crevices of the garden path. The moss is a deep velvety green, and it grows in the places where the shadow lingers longest and the stone stays damp and cool even in the heat of the afternoon. You have touched the moss many times, and you have marveled at the softness of it, and the way it yields under your fingers, and then springs back when you lift your hand away. The moss does not flower, and it does not produce any scent that you can detect, and it does not offer any fruit or any medicinal properties that the brothers in the infirmary have discovered. It is simply there, a living carpet that covers the stone and softens the edges and makes the garden feel older and more settled and more at peace with itself than it would feel if the stones were bare and the cracks were empty. The moss holds the moisture, and it provides a home for the tiny creatures that live in the soil, and it breaks down the surface of the stone over centuries and millennia and turns the limestone back into the soil from which it came. This is a process that is too slow to see and too vast to comprehend. And you do not try to see it or comprehend it because you understand that some things are meant to happen in their own time and at their own pace, and that the human mind is not equipped to grasp the full scope of the changes that shape the world over the course of eons. The moss grows between the stones, and you step on it sometimes when you are not paying attention, and your foot slicks slightly on the soft damp surface, and you catch yourself and continue on your way without any thought or concern, because the moss is not something to be avoided or protected, but simply something that is part of the path and part of the garden and part of the life that you live here. The yarrow is a plant that you know well because it grows in the meadow and along the edges of the fields and in the sunny places where the soil is thin and the competition from other plants is not too fierce. It has found a home in the wider cracks between the flagstones where the soil is a little deeper and the sun reaches down and warms the leaves and encourages the plant to send up its tall, slender stems and its flat clusters of tiny white flowers that look like lace or like the foam that gathers on the surface of the stream after a heavy rain. The leaves of the yarrow are feathery and finely divided, and they have a scent that is sharp and bitter and slightly medicinal, and you know that the brothers in the infirmary value this plant too, and use it to make a poultice that stops bleeding, and a tea that reduces fever and eases the aches that come with age and hard work. You have pulled the yarrow from between the stones on a few occasions when it grew too large and began to encroach on the path and trip the feet of the brothers who walked there. But you have never pulled it all, and you have always left a few plants to grow and bloom and set their seed and ensure that there will be yarrow between the stones for as long as the stones remain and the sun shines and the rain falls. The yarrow is a reminder that the garden is not a wilderness, but neither is it a place of strict human control, and that there is a middle ground where plants and people can coexist without one dominating the other or demanding more than the other can give. The plantain is a humble plant, and it is not beautiful in any conventional sense, and it does not have a scent that you would want to capture and preserve in a jar or a sachet. Its leaves are broad and oval, and they lie flat against the ground, and they are tough and stringy and difficult to pull when they have rooted themselves deeply into the cracks between the stones. The plantain has a spike of tiny green flowers that rises from the center of the rosette of leaves, and that produces a dusting of pale pollen that the bees ignore in favor of more fragrant and more rewarding blooms. But the plantain has its own quiet virtues, and you have learned to appreciate them over the years. The leaves can be crushed and applied to a cut or a sting, and they will draw out the poison and reduce the swelling and ease the pain. And you have used them for this purpose more times than you can remember, when a bee has accidentally stung your hand or your wrist, or the soft skin on the inside of your arm where the robe does not cover. The plantain asks for nothing, and it gives what it can, and it grows in the places where other plants cannot grow, and it persists through the heat of summer and the cold of winter, and the steady trampling of feet that pass over it day after day and year after year. This persistence is a kind of beauty, you think, though it is not the beauty of the rose or the lily or the lavender that fills the garden with color and scent, and draws the eye and the nose and the heart. It is the beauty of endurance and the beauty of quiet usefulness, and the beauty of a thing that is exactly what it is, and nothing more and nothing less. The sorrel grows in the corner near the well, where the stones are slightly sunken, and the water from the bucket drips down and keeps the soil moist, even in the driest weeks of summer. The leaves of the sorrel are shaped like arrowheads, and they are a bright, acidic green. And they have a taste that is sharp and lemony, and that makes your mouth pucker, and your eyes water if you chew on a leaf for too long. The brothers in the kitchen sometimes gather the sorrel and add it to the soup, to give it a tang that cuts through the richness of the broth and the heaviness of the beans and the root vegetables. You have tasted the soup, and you have appreciated the way the sorrel brightens the flavor and makes the meal feel lighter and more suited to the warm days of early summer, when the appetite is not as keen as it is in the cold months of winter. The sorrel between the stones is not gathered for the kitchen because it is too small and too scattered, and because the brothers have their own patch of it in the vegetable garden, where it grows in neat rows and is tended and watered and harvested with care. The sorrel between the stones is left to grow and spread, and to offer its sharp green leaves to anyone who happens to kneel down and notice them, and who knows what they are and what they can do. You kneel down now on the warm stones, and you feel the heat of the sun that has been soaking into the limestone all morning and all afternoon, and that is now radiating back up through your robe and into your knees and your shins and the palms of your hands that rest on the rough surface of the flagstone in front of you. From this low angle, the herbs that grow between the stones look different and larger and more significant than they do when you are standing and looking down at them from the height of a man. The thyme is a forest of tiny trees, and the chamomile is a grove of delicate white flowers that sway in the breeze, that you cannot feel but that you can see in the movement of the stems and the petals. The plant with the purple leaves is a carpet of deep color that spreads across the grey stone and disappears into the shadows under the overhanging leaves of the lavender. The wild strawberry is a network of runners and leaves, and the occasional flash of red that tells you the fruit is coming and will be ready soon, if the birds do not find it first. The moss is a soft green blanket that covers the edge of the stone and spills down into the crack and fills the space with its quiet, persistent life. The yarrow stands tall and proud, and its white flowers catch the light and seem to glow against the darker background of the soil and the stone. The plantain lies flat and humble, and its tough leaves are marked with the faint impressions of the feet that have passed over them and the small tears where an insect has nibbled at the edge. The sorrel is a cluster of bright green arrowheads that point in all directions and that look as if they are ready to take flight and soar away over the wall and into the meadow beyond. You reach out and touch a leaf of the thyme, and you feel the tiny hairs that cover its surface, and you smell the sharp, clean scent that rises from the place where your fingers have disturbed the oils that the plant produces to protect itself from the sun and the wind and the grazing of animals. The scent is familiar, and it is one of the scents that defines this garden and this life and this quiet corner of the world, where the bees hum and the thunder rumbles in the distance, and the herbs grow between the stones and ask nothing of anyone except the chance to live and grow and complete their small silent cycles of leaf and flower and seed and decay. You lift your hand and you bring your fingers to your nose and you inhale the scent of the thyme and you hold it in your lungs for a moment and then you let it go, and you watch it drift away on the warm air of the afternoon. The herbs that grow between the flagstones beneath your feet are not the reason you came to this garden, and they are not the focus of your work or your attention or your care, but they are part of the garden, and part of the life that you live here, and part of the quiet, persistent beauty that fills the cracks and crevices of the world, and asks only to be noticed and appreciated, and left to grow in peace. You rise slowly from your knees, and you feel the stiffness in your joints, and the warmth of the sun on your back, and the solid, reassuring presence of the stones beneath your feet, and the herbs that grow between them, and the bees that hum in the air, and the distant thunder that rolls across the northern horizon, and fades into the sound of the garden, and the sound of your own breathing, and the slow, steady beat of your heart. The wall that surrounds the garden is made of the same pale limestone that forms the bones of the hills, and the cliffs that rise up behind the monastery. And it has been standing in this place for so long that it no longer seems like something that was built by human hands, but rather like something that grew out of the earth, and was shaped by the wind and the rain, and the slow passage of the centuries into the form that you see before you now. The stones are large and irregular, and they are fitted together without mortar, in the places where the wall is oldest, and with a crumbling sandy mortar, in the places where it has been repaired over the years by brothers who are long dead, and whose names have been forgotten by everyone except perhaps the bees, who built their combs in the hollow spaces between the stones, and filled them with the sweetness of 1,000 summers. The wall rises to a height that is just tall enough to block the view of the valley below, and to create a sense of enclosure and protection without feeling oppressive or confining, and the top of it is capped with a layer of flat stones that tilt slightly outward to shed the rain and prevent the water from seeping down into the core and freezing in the winter and cracking the stones apart. Moss grows in the shaded crevices, and small ferns have found footholds in the places where the mortar has crumbled away, and there is a tangle of ivy that has climbed up from the base and spread across a section of the wall near the pear tree. Its dark green leaves overlapping each other like the scales of a fish, and its thin, woody stems gripping the stone with a tenacity that seems almost desperate and almost patient at the same time. The ivy is old, and its main stem is as thick as your wrist, where it emerges from the soil at the base of the wall, and you have watched it grow over the years, and you have seen it send out new tendrils and new leaves, and slowly, imperceptibly, claim more of the wall for itself with each passing season. You do not pull it down or cut it back, because the ivy does no harm to the wall, and because it provides shelter for the small birds that nest in its dense foliage, and because it is beautiful in its own dark, persistent way, and because the garden is not a place for imposing human will on the natural world, but a place for letting things be what they are, and grow where they will. The wall is not a single continuous barrier, but rather a series of sections that connect the various buildings of the monastery, and enclose the garden on 3 sides, while the 4th side is formed by the back wall of the chapel, where a small arched door leads into the sacristy, and is almost never used except on those rare occasions when the abbot himself comes to walk among the skeps and to taste the honey, and to offer a blessing for the bees and for the hands that tend them. The section of the wall that faces south is the one that you know best, because it is against this wall that the skeps are ranged in their gentle curve, and because it is this wall that catches the full force of the midday sun and radiates the warmth back into the garden long after the sun has set and the air has cooled and the bees have retreated into the darkness of their straw domes to cluster together and wait for the return of the light. The stones of the south wall are warm to the touch, even now in the late afternoon, and you have often placed your palm against them and felt the heat that has been stored there, and you have marveled at the way the stone remembers the sun and holds on to it like a promise that will be kept through the long hours of the night. The wall is thick and solid, and it blocks the wind that sometimes blows up from the valley and rattles the leaves of the pear tree and sends the lavender swaying and dipping and makes the bees work a little harder to hold their course as they fly back to the entrance of the skep with their loads of pollen and nectar. You are grateful for the wall on those windy days, and you are grateful for it on the still days too, because it creates a pocket of calm and quiet that is separate from the world beyond, and that allows the garden to exist in its own slow, patient rhythm without being disturbed by the things that happen on the other side. The wall is not silent, and it is not a perfect barrier against the sounds that rise up from the valley below, and from the roads that wind through the hills, and from the villages that cluster along the banks of the stream, and from the fields where the farmers work, and the animals graze, and the ordinary business of human life goes on in ways that you can only imagine, because you have not left the monastery grounds in many years, and you have no desire to do so. The sounds that come over the wall are faint and muffled, and they arrive in your ears as if from a great distance, which they do, and they are so softened by the stone in the distance and the intervening air that they lose their sharp edges and their urgent meanings and become simply part of the background hum of the world, no more significant or distracting than the sound of the bees or the rustle of the leaves or the distant rumble of thunder that has been present on the northern horizon for so many months now, but it trouts the canals. The sounds from the valley are many and varied, and they change with the seasons and the weather and the time of day, and you have learned to recognize them without thinking about them and to let them pass through your awareness without attaching any meaning or importance to them. In the early morning, when the air is still and cool and the mist lies heavy in the low places, you sometimes hear the distant crowing of a rooster from one of the farms that is tucked into a fold of the hills and hidden from view by the trees and the curves of the land. The sound is thin and faint, and it comes to you as if through a layer of wool, and it is followed by a silence that is deeper and more complete than the silence that came before it. And then the rooster crows again, and the sound fades and the morning continues on its slow, inevitable path toward the heat of the day. You do not know the rooster, and you've never seen it, and you do not know the farmer who owns it, or the farm where it lives, and this not knowing is not a lack, but a kind of freedom, a release from the burden of caring about things that are beyond your walls, and beyond your understanding, and beyond your power to affect in any meaningful way. Later in the morning, when the sun has risen higher and the world has woken fully, and the work of the day has begun in earnest, you sometimes hear the faint, rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood from somewhere in the forest that covers the slopes on the far side of the valley. The sound is a dull, distant thud that repeats at irregular intervals, and that is followed by a pause, and then another thud, and then another pause, and you know that someone is cutting firewood, or clearing a patch of land, or simply performing one of the 1,000 small tasks that make up a life lived in the company of trees and soil, and the slow turning of the seasons. The sound of the axe does not disturb you, and it does not make you curious about the person who wields it or the purpose for which the wood is being cut. It is simply a sound, and it comes over the wall, and it passes through the garden, and it disappears into the air and is gone, and you continue with your own work and your own small tasks, and the bees continue with theirs, and the wall continues to stand between you and the world, and to soften the edges of everything that tries to reach you from the other side. In the afternoon, when the heat is at its peak, and the garden is drowsy and still, and even the bees seem to move a little slower and with a little less urgency, you sometimes hear the distant lowing of cattle from the pastures that lie along the stream where the grass is green and lush, and the water runs cool and clear over the stones. The sound is a long, drawn-out note that rises and falls and carries with it a sense of deep animal contentment that is so pure and so simple that it makes you feel something that is not quite envy and not quite admiration, but something in between, a recognition of a kind of peace that is different from your own peace, but no less valid and no less real. The cattle are far away, and you cannot see them, and you do not know how many there are, or what they look like, or who tends them, and this not knowing is part of the sound's beauty, because it allows you to imagine them in whatever way you choose, and to fill in the blanks with the images that come to you from your own memory and your own experience of the world. You imagine them as large and brown and slow-moving, with soft eyes and wet noses, and the patient, enduring quality that cattle have always possessed and will always possess, regardless of the particular circumstances of their lives. They move through the tall grass, and they crop it with their broad, flat teeth, and they swish their tails to keep away the flies, and they make the low, rumbling sound that carries across the valley and over the wall and into the garden, where you stand and listen and feel the warmth of the sun on your back and the solid presence of the wall before you. The wall itself makes sounds if you listen closely enough, and if the garden is quiet and the wind is still, and the bees have settled into the steady background hum that is their constant gift to the world. The stones expand and contract with the heat of the day and the cool of the night, and this movement is so small and so slow that it cannot be seen or felt, but it can sometimes be heard as a faint, sharp crack that comes from deep within the wall, and that makes you look up from your work and wonder for a moment what it was, before you remember, and return your attention to the skep, or the smoker, or the herb that you are pulling from between the flagstones. The ivy creaks against the stone when the wind blows, and the tendrils rub against the rough surface, and make a sound that is like the sound of a door swinging slowly on old oiled hinges. The birds that nest in the ivy and in the hollow spaces between the stones make their own small sounds, the cheeping of the chicks when the parent returns with a beak full of insects, and the soft cooing murmur of the doves that have made their home in a crevice near the top of the wall where the stones have shifted over the years and left a gap that is just large enough for a dove to squeeze through and build a nest of twigs and press and feathers. You have watched the doves come and go many times, and you have seen them sitting on the top of the wall and preening their grey feathers and making the soft, repetitive call that is one of the most peaceful sounds in the world. And that seems to belong to the wall and to the garden and to the quiet, enclosed life that you lead here. The faint echoes from the valley below are not all peaceful, and they are not all easy to ignore, and there have been times over the past months when the sounds that came over the wall were sharper and louder and more difficult to set aside. You have heard the distant sound of shouting that carried on the wind and faded, and returned and faded again. And you have heard the sound of something that might have been a cart moving quickly over a rough road, or might have been something else entirely. And you have heard the sound of bells ringing from the village churches at odd hours and in strange, urgent patterns that did not match the regular call to prayer that you have known all your life. These sounds are not common and they do not last, and they are always followed by long periods of silence that are deeper and more complete than the ordinary silence of the garden, as if the world itself is holding its breath and waiting for something that you do not understand and do not want to understand. When these sounds come, you do not go to the wall, and you do not try to look over it or through it or around it, because the wall is not a window and it is not meant to be seen through, and because the world beyond the wall is not your concern and has not been your concern for many years. You turn your attention instead to the things that are within your reach and within your care. The skeps and the bees and the herbs that grow between the stones in the smoker that hangs from its peg in the shed, and the well bucket that needs to be lowered and raised, and the lavender that needs to be watered, and the chamomile that needs to be harvested for the infirmary. These things are real and present, and they demand nothing of you except your steady hands and your patient heart, and you give them both without reservation and without regret. The wall is old, and it has stood through wars and plagues and famines and all the other troubles that have swept across this land in the centuries since it was built, and it will continue to stand long after the current troubles have passed and been forgotten and replaced by new troubles that will also pass and be forgotten in their turn. This is the nature of walls, and this is the nature of the world, and you have learned to accept both without resistance or complaint, because resistance and complaint change nothing and only disturb the peace that you have worked so hard to cultivate within yourself and within the garden. The wall does not judge the sounds that come over it, and it does not distinguish between the peaceful and the troubling, and it does not care about the meanings that human beings attach to the noises they make and the things they do. The wall simply stands, and it absorbs the sounds and it softens them, and it passes them on to you in a form that is diminished and muted and stripped of the urgency that they possessed when they were first created. This is a gift that the wall gives you every day and every night, and you accept it with the same quiet gratitude that you feel for the warmth of the sun and the sweetness of the honey, and the steady, reassuring hum of the bees that fills the garden and fills your ears and fills the spaces in your mind where worry and fear and doubt would otherwise take root and grow. You walk toward the wall now, and you place your hand against the surface of the stone, and you feel the rough texture under your palm, and the warmth that radiates from deep within the limestone, and the faint vibration that might be the movement of the earth far below, or might be the echo of the distant thunder that has rumbled on the northern horizon all day, or might be nothing at all except the product of your own imagination and your own desire to feel connected to something larger than yourself. The stone is solid and real, and it anchors you to this place and this moment and this life that you have chosen and that has chosen you, and you stand there for a long time with your hand on the wall and your eyes half closed against the brightness of the afternoon, and your ears filled with the sound of the bees and the rustle of the leaves and the faint, distant lowing of the cattle that drifts up from the valley and passes over the garden and disappears into the air and is gone. The wall is a boundary and a barrier and a protection, but it is also a connection and a conduit, and a reminder that the world beyond the garden exists and continues to turn and continues to generate its endless stream of sounds and movements and events that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with the vast, complicated tapestry of human life that you have chosen to step away from and to observe only from a distance and through the softening filter of the stone and the ivy and the moss and the quiet years that it have kept. The afternoon wears on and the shadows lengthen and the wall begins to release the heat that it has stored throughout the day, and you feel it radiating against your face and your chest and the palms of your hands as you stand there and let the peace of the garden settle over you like a second robe. A robe made not of wool but of stillness and silence and the slow, steady passage of time that means nothing and everything all at once. The faint echoes from the valley below continue to drift over the wall at irregular intervals. A dog barking somewhere far away, and the distant creak of a cartwheel, and the sound of a human voice that is too faint to distinguish any words, and that might be singing or calling or simply speaking to someone who is standing nearby, and who cannot be heard at all. These sounds are the background music of your life, and you have grown so accustomed to them that you would miss them if they were gone. Just as you would miss the sound of the bees if the hives were suddenly silent and the garden was filled with a quiet that was too deep and too complete and too much like the quiet of a tomb. The wall stands between you and the source of these sounds, and it does its work without complaint or recognition. And you are grateful for it in a way that you have never put into words and never will put into words, because some kinds of gratitude are too deep and too constant to be expressed, and are better left to exist in the quiet spaces of the heart where they can grow and deepen and become part of the fabric of who you are and how you live and what you value. In this small enclosed world of straw and stone and bees and patient and the ring, the afternoon has a way of stretching itself out across the garden like a length of cloth that has been left to dry on the grass, each hour longer and slower than the hour that came before it, each minute filled with a quiet that is so complete and so undisturbed that you can hear the smallest sounds with a clarity that is almost startling. The bees have been flying since the warmth of the morning told them that the flowers were open and the nectar was flowing, and now in the long golden light of the afternoon they continue their work with the same steady, unhurried purpose that they have shown since the first moment you stepped into the garden and heard the hum of their wings rising from the straw domes against the south wall. You have moved a wooden bench to a spot where you can see the entrances of all 7 skeps without turning your head more than a few inches to the left or the right, and you have settled yourself onto the weathered planks with your hands folded in your lap, and your breathing slow and even, and your attention focused on the small dark openings where the bees appear and disappear into continuous unbroken stream that never changes its rhythm and never fails to hold your interest, no matter how many hours you spend it. The watching is not a task, and it is not a duty, and it is not something that you do because someone has told you to do it, or because it serves any practical purpose in the larger scheme of the garden and the monastery and the world. The watching is simply something that happens when you sit on the bench in the long afternoon and let your eyes rest on the entrances of the skeps, and let your mind drift into that state of quiet awareness where the passage of time becomes soft and indistinct, and the only thing that matters is the small brown bodies that crawl out of the darkness and launch themselves into the air and return again with their legs heavy and their wings tired and their bodies dusted with the evidence of the places they have been. The entrance of hives at Kep is a simple thing, and it is easy to overlook if you're not paying attention and if you do not understand the significance of what happens there in the course of a single afternoon. It is a gap in the straw coils that is no wider than the width of your hand and no taller than the height of 2 fingers held together, and it is framed by a small wooden landing board that extends outward from the base of the skep and provides a place for the bees to rest and to groom themselves and to adjust their loads before they push through the opening and disappear into the warm, fragrant darkness where the queen is waiting and the combs are growing and the honey is ripening in its cells of wax. The landing board is worn smooth by the passage of countless tiny feet, and it is stained dark with the propolis that the bees have spread across its surface to seal the wood and to create a kind of welcome mat that is both functional and symbolic, a boundary between the vast, unpredictable world outside and the safe, ordered world within. You have watched the bees on this landing board so many times that you have begun to recognize individual patterns of behavior, not in the sense of knowing one bee from another, because that would be impossible given the sheer number of them and the brevity of their lives, but in the sense of understanding the small variations in how they approach the entrance and how they navigate the crowd of their sisters who are also trying to enter or leave, and how they respond to the occasional collisions and the brief polite adjustments that bodies are narrow. Spate, some bees arrive at the landing board with a great deal of momentum and they touch down and immediately walk forward into the darkness without any pause or hesitation, as if they are eager to deliver their load of pollen or nectar and to return to the air and the flowers and the work that defines their existence. Other bees land more gently and they pause on the board and they groom their wings with their front legs and they adjust the pollen that is packed into the baskets on their hind legs, and they seem to take a moment to rest and to gather themselves before they proceed into the hive. And still other bees emerge from the entrance, and they stand on the landing board for a long time, facing outward and moving their antennae in slow, deliberate arcs, as if they are testing the air and reading the signals that it carries and deciding whether the conditions are right for the flight that they are about to undertake. The counting of the pollen is not something that you do with numbers or with any formal system of record keeping, because the numbers would be too large and too variable, and because the act of counting would interfere with the act of watching and would turn a peaceful, meditative practice into a task that demanded attention and effort and a certain kind of mental sharpness that you have no desire to maintain in the long, drowsy hours of the afternoon. Instead, you count the pollen in a different way, a way that is more about noticing and appreciating than it is about quantifying and categorizing. You notice the colors of the pollen that the returning bees carry on their legs, and you notice how those colors change over the course of the afternoon as the bees shift their attention from one type of flower to another in response to the changing temperature and the shifting light, and the gradual depletion of the nectar in the brooms that they visited earlier in the day. In the morning the pollen was mostly pale yellow, and it came from the clover that grows in the meadow, and from the dandelions that dot the edges of the fields, and from the wild mustard that is spread across the sunny slopes where the soil is thin and the competition from other plants is not too fierce. The pale yellow pollen is the most common, and it is the color that you see most often when you glance at the landing board and watch the bees disappear into the darkness with their legs coated in a fine, dusty layer that looks like flour or like the pollen that falls from the stamens of the lilies when you brush against them in the garden. As the morning gave way to the afternoon, the colors began to shift and to diversify, and now in the long golden light of the late afternoon, you see a whole palette of hues that range from the bright, almost fluorescent orange of the pollen that comes from the poppies that grow along the edges of the wheat fields, to the deep, rich brown of the pollen that comes from the hedgerows where the brambles are beginning to bloom and the wild roses are opening their pink and white petals to the sun. There is a bee that lands on the board in front of you with her legs covered in a pollen that is the color of rust, a deep reddish brown that is so dark it is almost black, and you do not know what flower produces pollen of that particular shade, but you appreciate it nonetheless, and you watch as the bee walks into the entrance and disappears and carries her strange dark treasure into the hive, where it will be packed into cells and mixed with nectar and transformed into the food that will sustain the young bees and the whole intricate society that pulses within the straw wood. The traffic at the entrances is not uniform across all 7 skeps, and you have learned to recognize the subtle differences that indicate the health and the mood and the particular circumstances of each colony. The skep nearest the pear tree is the oldest, and its colony is the largest and the most established, and the traffic at its entrance is a dense, continuous flow that seems almost frantic compared to the more measured pace of the other hives. The bees from this skep come and go in a steady stream that never thins and never slows and never shows any sign of the kind of hesitation or uncertainty that you sometimes see at the entrances of the younger colonies, where the population is smaller and the workforce is still building its numbers and its confidence. The older skeps sends out foragers that are larger and darker, and that seem to fly with a particular sense of purpose, and they return with loads that are heavy and varied, and that speak of a wide-ranging knowledge of the surrounding countryside and all the flowers that bloom within a certain radius of the monastery walls. The skep at the far end of the curve is the youngest, and its traffic is sparser and more intermittent, with longer pauses between the arrivals and departures, and a greater proportion of young bees that stand on the landing board and fan their wings to circulate the air, and that seem to be learning the skills that they will need when they are older and ready to join the ranks of the foragers. You watch these young bees with a particular tenderness because you have seen them emerge from their cells as pale, soft-bodied creatures that could barely walk, and you have watched them grow and darken and take on the responsibilities of the hive one by one, and you know that they will not live to see the autumn and that their brief lives will be spent entirely in the service of the colony and the queen and the endless, patient work of gathering and storing and tending and the building. This knowledge does not make you sad because sadness is not the appropriate response to the natural order of things, and because the bees themselves do not seem to experience anything like sadness or regret, or the kind of existential dread that sometimes afflicts human beings when they contemplate the brevity of their own existence. The bees simply live and work and die and are replaced by new bees that emerge from the cells that they help to clean and to warm and to provision. And the cycle continues without interruption or complaint and without any need for the kind of meaning or purpose that human beings are always searching for, and so rarely find. The counting of the pollen is also a way of tracking the seasons and the progress of the summer, and the slow, steady accumulation of the stores that will sustain the hives through the winter when the flowers are gone and the ground is frozen, and the bees are clustered together in the darkness of the skeps and living on the honey that they gathered in the long, golden days of June and July and August. You have learned to read the colors and the quantities of the pollen as a kind of language that tells you things that the bees cannot tell you in words. Things about the state of the meadows and the hedgerows and the forests that lie beyond the walls, and the things that are happening in the wider world that you cannot see and do not need to see, and do not need to see. When the pollen is predominantly pale yellow and white, you know that the clover and the wild carrot and the yarrow are blooming, and that the bees are finding plenty of food close to home, and that the colonies are growing and thriving and filling their combs with the sweet, pale honey that will be harvested in the autumn and stored in the cool darkness of the cellar beneath the monastery. When the pollen shifts to the deeper, richer colors of orange and red and brown, you know that the poppies and the brambles and the hedgerow flowers are reaching their peak, and that the bees are ranging farther afield and gathering the more intense, more flavorful nectars that will produce a darker, more complex honey that is prized by the abbot and reserved for special occasions and for the honored guests who sometimes visit the monastery, and are served bread and honey and a cup of the sweet golden wine that the grapes that grow on the south-facing slope beyond the growth that creates traditum. The pollen tells you these things, and you listen to it with the same quiet attention that you give to the sound of the bees and the rustle of the leaves and the distant rumble of the thunder that has become so familiar that you no longer notice it unless you make a conscious effort to do so. The long afternoon wears on, and the shadows of the pear trees stretch across the stones and reach toward the base of the wall where the skeps are arranged in their gentle curve. The light changes from the bright, clear gold of midday to a softer, warmer hue that seems to wrap itself around everything it touches, and to make the garden feel even more enclosed and even more separate from the world beyond the walls. The bees continue to fly, and the traffic at the entrances continues to flow, and you continue to sit on the bench and watch and count the pollen in the quiet, wordless way that you have developed over the years. A bee lands on the board with a load of pollen that is the color of fresh butter, a pale, creamy yellow that is almost white, and that stands out against the darker colors of the other bees and the other pollens that are coming and going in the afternoon light. You watch this bee for a moment longer than you watch the others, because the color is unusual and because it reminds you of something that you cannot quite name. A memory of a meal or a flower or a particular quality of light that you experienced once, and that has stayed with you in a form that is more feeling than image. The bee walks into the entrance and disappears, and the moment passes, and you return your attention to the general flow of the traffic and the steady, reassuring hum that fills the garden and fills your ears and fills the spaces in your mind where thoughts of the past and the future would otherwise intrude and disturb the peace of the afternoon. The counting of the pollen is not a task that has a beginning or an end, and it is not something that you can ever complete or finish or set aside with a sense of accomplishment. It is simply a way of being present, and a way of paying attention, and a way of connecting yourself to the lives of the bees and the rhythms of the garden and the slow, patient turning of the seasons. You do not know how many bees have passed before your eyes in the hours that you've been sitting on the bench, and you do not know how many different colors of pollen you have seen or how many flowers have contributed to the loads that the bees have carried back to the hives. The numbers are not important, and the knowledge is not important, and the only thing that matters is the act of watching itself and the quiet, steady awareness that fills your mind and your body, and makes you feel as if you are part of the garden and part of the bees and part of the long, golden afternoon that stretches out before you, with no end in sight and no need for an end. The thunder rumbles again in the distance and you hear it, and you let it pass through you, and you return your attention to the entrance of the nearest skep, where a bee has just emerged and is standing on the landing board and grooming her wings and preparing herself for the flight that will take her out over the wall and into the meadows and the fields and the hedgerows, where the flowers are waiting and the nectar is flowing, and the work of the afternoon is still waiting to be done. The sound of the Vespers bell begins not as a sound, but as a change in the quality of the silence that has filled the garden through the long golden hours of the afternoon, a subtle shift that you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears, and that tells you the day has reached the point where the light begins to soften, and the shadows begin to lengthen, and the bees begin to think about returning to the darkness of their straw domes for the night that is coming. The bell hangs in the small stone tower that rises above the chapel roof on the far side of the monastery, and it has hung there for so long that the iron of its clapper has worn a smooth, shallow depression into the bronze of its rim, and the sound it produces is no longer the sharp, clear note that it made when it was first cast and hung and blessed by hands that have long since returned to the dust. The sound is softer now, and it spreads outward from the tower in slow, concentric waves that wash over the tiles of the roof and the stones of the walls and the leaves of the pear tree and the dome tops of the skeps, and finally reach you where you sit on the wooden bench with your hands folded and your eyes half closed and your mind drifting in the quiet space between waking and dreaming. The bell rings once, and then there is a pause that lasts for the space of a slow breath, and then it rings again, and the sound is deeper and richer than the first, and it seems to linger in the air for a moment longer before it fades into the hum of the bees and the dees and the distant rumble of the thunder that has been present on the northern horizon all day and that now seems to be receding with the approach of evening. The lavender catches the sound in a way that the other plants in the garden do not, or perhaps it is simply that the lavender is the plant you are looking at when the bell begins to ring, and your attention is already focused on the grey-green stalks and the purple buds that are just beginning to open and release their scent into the warm, still air of the early evening. The sound of the bell seems to pass over the lavender and to cause the slender stalks to tremble slightly, though you know that this is an illusion created by the way your eyes and your ears work together to make sense of the world, and that the bell is not loud enough to move the air in any way that would disturb the plants. The illusion is pleasant, and you do not try to dispel it with logic or reason, because the garden is not a place for logic or reason, but a place for the kind of quiet sensory experience that fills the mind with peace and leaves no room for the sharp edges of thought and analysis and the endless circular arguments that the human mind is so fond of constructing. The lavender sways in the breeze that you cannot feel, and the bell rings again, and the sound drifts across the garden and wraps itself around the stalks and the buds and the small industrious bees that are still working among the flowers, even as the light begins to fade and the temperature begins to drop, and the time for returning to the hive draws closer with each passing moment. The Vespers bell is the signal that marks the transition from the working hours of the day to the quiet hours of the evening. And it is a signal that you have heard so many times that it has become part of the rhythm of your body and your breath and your blood. You do not need to count the rings or to pay attention to the pattern, because your body knows the pattern and responds to it without any conscious direction from the part of you that thinks and plans and worries about things that have not happened and may never happen. The bell rings, and your shoulders drop slightly, and your jaw unclenches, and your breathing slows and deepens and becomes more regular, and you feel the tension that you did not know you were holding drain out of your muscles and disappear into the stones at your feet. The bees seem to respond to the bell as well, though you know that this is another illusion and that they are responding not to the sound but to the fading light and the cooling air and the ancient instinctual knowledge that tells them when it is time to return to the safety of the hive and to cluster together with their sisters and to rest through the hours of darkness. The traffic at the entrances of the skeps begins to change in subtle ways that you have learned to recognize over the years, the outgoing flights becoming fewer and the incoming flights becoming more frequent as the foragers, who have been working in the distant fields and meadows, make their way back to the garden and the straw domes that are their homes. The bees that arrive now are heavier and slower than the bees that departed in the morning and the afternoon, their bodies laden with the last loads of pollen and nectar that they have gathered from the flowers that close their petals as the light fades and that will not open again until the sun returns and warms the world and calls the bees back to their endless, patient work. The sound of the bell drifts over the lavender and it reaches you where you sit on the bench, and it fills your ears and your mind with a resonance that is both physical and emotional, a vibration that you feel in your chest and in the bones of your face and in the soft, deep place behind your eyes where the thoughts of the day have been accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. The bell rings again and the sound is fainter now because the ringer has moved on to the next part of the pattern and the sound is traveling away from you and toward the other parts of the monastery and the other brothers who are pausing in their work and turning their faces toward the chapel and preparing themselves for the evening prayers that will mark the end of the working day and the beginning of the long, quiet hours of the night. You do not rise from the bench and you do not turn toward the chapel because your work is not the kind of work that can be set aside at the sound of a bell, and because the bees do not understand bells, and they do not understand prayers, and they only understand the light, and the temperature, and the ancient rhythms that govern their lives in ways that are deeper and older than any human institution or tradition. The bell rings for the last time and the sound fades into the hum of the bees and the rustle of the leaves and the distant, barely audible rumble of the thunder that has moved further north and is now so faint that you cannot be sure whether you are hearing it or remembering it or simply imagining it because your ears have grown so accustomed to its presence that they create it even when it is not there. The evening light has a quality that is different from the light of the morning and the afternoon, a softness and a warmth that seems to come from within the objects themselves rather than from the sun that is sinking toward the horizon and casting long golden rays across the valley and the hills and the garden where you sit and watch the lavender and listen to the fading echo of the bell. The lavender glows in this light, and the purple of the buds is deeper and richer than it was in the harsh bright light of midday, and the grey-green of the leaves takes on a silvery sheen that makes the whole plant look as if it has been dusted with a fine layer of something precious and rare. The bees that are still working among the lavender move more slowly now, and they seem to linger on each flower for a moment longer than they did in the morning, as if they are savouring the last drops of nectar and the last warmth of the sun, and the last warmth of the sun, and the last moments of the day before they must return to the darkness of the hive and the company of their sisters and the long, still hours of the night. You watch one particular bee as she crawls across a spike of lavender and probes each tiny purple flower with her tongue, and then moves on to the next and the next. Her movements slow and deliberate and full of a kind of contentment that is so pure and so complete that it makes you feel something that is not quite envy and not quite admiration, but something in between, a recognition of a peace that is different from your own peace but no less valid and no less real. The bee reaches the end of the spike and she pauses there for a moment, and then she launches herself into the air and flies in a slow, meandering path toward the entrance of the nearest skep, and you watch her go, and you feel the warmth of the evening on your face and the scent of the lavender in your nose and the quiet, steady hum of the garden in your ears. The Vespers bell has fallen silent now, and the silence that follows it is deeper and more complete than the silence that came before, as if the sound of the bell has swept away all the small, accumulated noises of the day and left behind a kind of auditory blankness that is both peaceful and slightly unsettling. You have experienced this silence many times, and you have learned to welcome it and to let it settle over you like a blanket, and to allow your mind to drift into the spaces that the bell has cleared, and to rest there in the quiet that is not truly quiet, because the bees are still humming, and the leaves are still rustling, and the distant thunder is still rumbling, somewhere far away on the northern horizon. The silence after the bell is a silence that contains all the other sounds of the garden, and holds them in a kind of balance, each one distinct and clear, and yet somehow part of a larger whole that is more than the sum of its parts. You can hear the individual bees now in a way that you could not hear them when the bell was ringing and the sound was filling your ears and your mind and leaving no room for the smaller, subtler noises that make up the fabric of the garden's life. A bee buzzes past your ear, and you hear the particular pitch of its wings, and you know without looking that it is a young bee, and that it is still learning to fly, and that its movements are slightly unsteady and uncertain compared to the smooth, confident flight of the older foragers. Another bee lands on the lavender near your hand, and you hear the soft, scratchy sound of its feet on the stem, and the faint, wet sound of its tongue probing the flower, and you feel a connection to this small creature that is so complete and so wordless that it needs no explanation or justification. The light continues to fade, and the colors of the garden begin to shift from the warm golds and greens of the afternoon to the cooler blues and purples of the evening, and the lavender that was glowing just a few moments ago now seems to recede into the general dimness and to become part of the larger pattern of shadows and shapes that fills the garden as the day gives way to the night. The bees have mostly returned to the hives now, and the traffic at the entrances has slowed to a trickle of late arrivals that land on the boards and walk quickly into the darkness without any of the hesitation or the grooming that characterized their earlier returns. The entrance of the oldest skep is almost completely still, and the only movement you can see is the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the guard bees that stand just inside the opening and fan their wings to circulate the air and to regulate the temperature of the hive through the cool hours of the night. You know that inside the skep, the bees are clustering together and forming the dense, living ball that will keep the queen warm and safe, and that will maintain the temperature of the brood nest at the precise level that is required for the young bees to develop and to emerge healthy and strong, and ready to take their place in the endless, patient work of the colony. The honey that they gathered during the day is being processed and stored, and the pollen is being packed into cells, and the wax is being shaped and smoothed, and the whole intricate machinery of the hive is ticking away in the warm, fragrant darkness, and you sit on the bench and you listen to the faint, muffled hum that rises from the straw domes, and you feel a sense of peace that is so deep and so complete that it seems to fill every part of you and to leave no room for anything else. The scent of the lavender is stronger now than it was during the heat of the day, or perhaps it is simply that your other senses have quieted, and your sense of smell has become more acute in the fading light and the growing stillness. The scent drifts across the garden, and it reaches you where you sit, and it fills your nose and your lungs and your mind with a sweetness that is both sharp and soft. A sweetness that speaks of the sun and the soil and the patient, enduring life of the plants that grow in this enclosed space and that ask nothing of anyone except the chance to live and to bloom and to complete their small silent cycles of leaf and flower and seed and decay. You breathe in the scent of the lavender, and you hold it in your lungs for a moment, and then you let it go, and you watch it drift away on the cool evening air that is beginning to move through the garden and to stir the leaves of the pear tree and to carry with it the faint, distant smell of wood smoke from the chimneys of the monastery, where the brothers are preparing the evening meal and the fires are being lit against the chill of the night. The scent of the wood smoke mingles with the scent of the lavender and creates a combination that is both familiar and strange, a combination that speaks of the end of the day and the beginning of the night and the slow, patient turning of the hours that has been going on since long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. You rise from the bench slowly, and your joints make the small sounds of protest that they have made every evening for years, and you stand for a moment in the gathering darkness, and you look across the garden at the skeps that are now silent and still, and at the lavender that is fading into the shadows, and at the wall that stands between you and the world, and that has stood there for so long that it seems like a part of the earth itself. The sound of the Vespers bell is gone now, and it will not return until tomorrow evening, when the light begins to fade and the bees begin to return and the cycle of the day completes itself once more and gives way to the quiet of the night. You turn away from the garden and you walk slowly toward the door that leads back into the monastery and the small cell where you will sleep and dream of things that you will not remember in the morning. And as you walk, you carry with you the scent of the lavender and the memory of the bell and the quiet, steady hum of the bees that has filled your ears and your mind and your heart through all the hours of the long, golden afternoon. The evening settles over the garden like a second blanket, and the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, and the first cool breath of the night wind moves through the lavender and carries its scent up and over the wall and out into the valley where it will mingle with the other scents of the evening, and eventually fade and disappear and be forgotten by everyone except perhaps the bees, who will remember it in the lavender. Tomorrow, when the sun rises and the bell rings again and the long, patient work of the day begins once more, the evening has a way of arriving in the garden without announcement or fanfare, creeping in from the edges of the sky and the shadows at the base of the wall, and the coolness that rises from the stones as the sun drops below the line of the hills and leaves behind only a faint golden glow that lingers in the west, like the memory of a fire that has burned down to embers and will soon be nothing but ash and darkness. You've been sitting on the wooden bench for a long time, and you have watched the light change and the shadows lengthen, and the bees return from their final foraging flights of the day, their bodies heavy with the last loads of pollen and nectar that they have gathered from the flowers that are now closing their petals and preparing themselves for the long, cool hours of the night. The traffic at the entrances of the skeps has slowed to a thin, intermittent trickle, and most of the bees are already inside the straw domes where they are clustering together and forming the dense, living ball that will keep the queen warm and safe and that will maintain the temperature of the brood nest at the precise level that is required for the young bees to develop and to emerge healthy and strong. The hum that rises from the skeps is softer now, and it has a different quality than the bright, energetic hum of the morning and the afternoon, a quality that is more like a sigh than a song, and that speaks of rest and contentment and the slow, patient work of settling into the darkness for the hours that lie ahead. You rise from the bench, and your body makes the small, familiar sounds of movement that it has made every evening for as many years as you can remember. The soft pop of a knee, and the rustle of the wool robe, and the quiet sigh of breath that escapes your lips as you stand and feel the stiffness in your back and your shoulders and your neck. The garden is almost completely still now, and the only movement you can see is the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the guard bees that stand just inside the entrances and fan their wings to circulate the air and to regulate the temperature of the hives through the cool hours of the night. And the only sounds are the rustle of the leaves in the pear tree and the distant, barely audible rumble of the thunder that has moved so far to the north that it is now nothing more than a faint vibration in the air, that you feel rather than hear, that you rather than hear. You walk slowly across the stones and your bare feet are cool against the surface that has been releasing the warmth of the day into the evening air, and you stop at the well, and you lower the bucket and you hear the splash when it meets the water far below, and you pull it up hand over hand with the rope that is rough and damp and familiar in your grip. The water is cold and it clears the last of the afternoon's drowsiness from your throat, and you stand there for a moment with the bucket resting on the stone rim and your hands cupped around the cool, wet clay, and your eyes looking out across the garden at the skeps that are now silent and dark against the pale stone of the wall. The closing of the hives for the evening is not a single action, but a series of small observations and small adjustments that you have performed so many times that they have become automatic and unremarkable, a part of the rhythm of your days that is as natural and as necessary as breathing. You walk to the first skep, and you kneel down on the stones, and you bring your face close to the entrance, and you listen to the sound that comes from within, a sound that is not the loud, busy hum of the daylight hours, but a softer, deeper sound that is more like the purr of a contented animal or the distant murmur of a stream that flows over stones in the darkness of a forest. The sound tells you that the colony is settled, and that the bees have formed their cluster, and that the temperature inside the skep is stable and warm, and that there is nothing to be done except to let them rest and to trust that they will survive the night and emerge again in the morning when the sun returns and the flowers open and the long, patient work of the day begins again. You move to the next skep and you repeat the process, and you hear the same soft, contented sound, and you feel the same quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that the creatures in your care are safe and comfortable, and that you have done what you can to ensure their well-being through the hours of darkness. You visit all 7 skeps in this way, and you find nothing that causes you concern and nothing that requires your intervention. And this is the best possible outcome of the evening ritual, and the one that you have come to expect and to appreciate without taking it for granted, because you have learned over the years that the bees are resilient and resourceful, and that they need very little from you except a steady hand and a quiet presence and the occasional repair to the homes that you whine and the rain and the cold. The repair of the thatch is a task that you have been meaning to attend to since the morning when you noticed the loose strand on the 3rd skep from the pear tree. the one where the straw has been darkened by the dampness of the ground, and the thatch has been worn thin by the winter winds and the spring rains, and the steady, patient work of time and weather. You have put off the repair through the long hours of the afternoon because there was no urgency, and because the bees were active, and because you did not want to disturb them with your hands and your tools, and the small necessary intrusions that are required when you work on the surface of their homes. But now the bees are settled, and the light is fading and the garden is quiet, and this is the best time for the kind of slow, careful work that the repair requires. You walk to the shed, and you open the wooden door, and you feel the familiar smell of old straw and dry wood, and the sharp, resinous scent of the pine needles that you gathered last autumn. And you reach up to the peg where the bundle of willow bark hangs, and you take a length of it, and you feel the rough, fibrous texture and the slight give that tells you it is still pliable enough to be tied into a tight knot without cracking or breaking. You also take a wooden peg from the small clay pot that sits on the shelf, and you choose one that is straight and true and that has been carved from a branch of the pear tree and sharpened to a point that will penetrate the straw and the thatch and hold fast against the pull of the wind and the weight of the rain. The mallet is hanging from its own peg, and you take it down, and you feel the familiar weight of it in your hand, and the smooth, polished surface of the wood that has been worn by years of use and years of contact with your palm and your fingers. You carry these things across the garden, and you kneel down beside the third skep, and you set the willow bark and the peg and the mallet on the stones beside you, and you look up at the place where the thatch has loosened, and you see the pale, worn spot where the straw has been exposed to the weather, and the darker, healthier straw that surrounds it on all sides. The loose strand is not large, and it is not a threat to the integrity of the skep or the comfort of the bees, but you have learned over the years that small problems have a way of becoming large problems if they are left unattended, and that the best time to repair a thatch is when the damage is still minor and the weather is still mild and the bees are still healthy and strong. You reach up and you take the loose strand of straw between your fingers and you pull it gently back into place, and you hold it there while you reach for the length of willow bark with your other hand. The bark is cool and slightly damp from the air of the shed, and it bends easily as you wrap it around the strand and the adjacent coils, and you pull it tight, and you tie it with a knot that is simple and secure, and that you have tied so many times that your fingers perform the movements without any conscious direction from the part of you that thinks and plans and worries about things that have not happened and may never happen. The knot holds, and the strand is now bound to the rest of the thatch, and it will not come loose again unless the wind is very strong and the rain is very heavy and the straw itself begins to weaken and decay, which will not happen for a long time and which will be a problem for another evening and another repair. The wooden peg is the next part of the process, and you pick it up and you hold it against the place where the thatch meets the body of the skep, and you position it so that it will pass through the loose strand and into the denser straw beneath, and anchor everything together in a way that is both strong and gentle. You take the mallet in your other hand and you raise it slowly and you bring it down with a soft, muffled thud that is absorbed by the straw and the earth and does not echo or disturb the bees or the quiet of the garden. The peg sinks into the thatch and you strike it again, and it goes deeper and you strike it a third time, and it is flush with the surface of the straw, and it will hold against the wind and the rain and the slow, patient work of time and weather. You run your fingers over the peg and the knot and the repaired thatch, and you feel the smooth, secure surface, and you know that the work is done and that the skep is once again whole and ready to face whatever the night and the coming days may bring. The bees inside do not stir, and they do not seem to notice the small intrusion that has taken place on the surface of their home, and this is as it should be, and this is what you have worked so hard to achieve over the years. A relationship with the bees that is based on trust and gentleness and the understanding that your hams are not a threat but a comfort, and that your presence in the garden is not an intrusion but a part of the natural order of things. You gather the remaining willow bark and the mallet, and you carry them back to the shed, and you hang the mallet on its peg, and you place the bark back on its hook, and you close the wooden door, and you hear the soft creak of the leather hinges that is as familiar to you as the sound of your own breathing. The garden is almost completely dark now, and the stars are beginning to appear in the sky above the walls, faint points of light that are barely visible against the deep blue of the evening, and that will grow brighter and more numerous as the night deepens and the world settles into the long, still hours that lie ahead. You walk back to the skeps, and you stand in the curve of them, and you listen to the soft, contented hum that rises from the straw domes, and you feel the coolness of the evening air on your face, and the solid presence of the wall behind you, and the quiet, steady beat of your own heart that marks the passage of time in a way that is older and truer than any clock. The bees are closed for the night, and the thatch is repaired, and the garden is at peace, and you are at peace too, in a way that is difficult to describe but easy to feel, a peace that settles into the spaces between your thoughts and fills them with a quiet that is both empty and full at the same time. The closing of the hives is also a closing of something within yourself, a letting go of the small concerns and the small tasks that have occupied your attention through the hours of the day, and a turning inward toward the rest and the darkness and the slow, patient work of sleep that will restore your body and your mind and prepare you for the morning when the sun returns and the bees emerge and the cycle begins again. You standeth in the garden, standeth beneath the driver you, and you feel the coolness of the stones beneath your feet, and the faint, distant rumble of the thunder that is now so far away that it is nothing more than a memory of a sound. And you think about the bees and the skeps and the straw and the thatch and the small perfect hexagons of wax that are hidden in the darkness, and that are filled with the honey that will sighten the colonies, the wormy culled, garns a bind that get him. The night deepens and the stars brighten, and the first cool breath of the night wind moves through the garden and stirs the leaves of the pear tree, and carries with it the scent of the lavender and the rosemary and the wild thyme that grows between the flagstones, and you turn away from the skeps and you walk slowly toward the door that leads back into the monastery, and the small cell where you will sleep and dream of things that you will not remember in the morning, and you carry with you the quiet satisfaction of a day that has been spent in the company of bees and the slow pay that it is mauled that the light fades from the limestone in a way that is so slow and so gradual that you cannot see it happening, even if you stand perfectly still and watch the surface of the wall with an attention that is complete and unwavering. The stone that was warm and golden in the afternoon becomes first a softer shade of cream, and then a pale silvery grey, and finally a deep cool blue that merges with the shadows and the twilight and the approaching darkness, until you can no longer tell where the wall ends and the night begins. This fading is not a single event, but a long, patient process that unfolds over the course of many minutes and many small, incremental changes that are too subtle to notice in the moment, and that only become apparent when you look back and realize that the wall is no longer the color it was when you first stepped out of the shed and knelt beside the skeps and repaired the thatch with the willow bark and the wooden peg. The limestone has held the warmth of the sun through all the hours of the afternoon, and it has radiated that warmth back into the garden and into the air and into your face and your hands as you stood beside it and watched the bees return and listened to the soft, contented hum that rose from the straw domes. Now the warmth is fading too, and the stone is cooling and releasing the last of its stored heat into the evening air, and you can feel the difference when you reach out and place your palm against the surface and find that it is no longer warm, but merely cool and smooth and solid and real in a way that is comforting and grounding and that anchors you to this place and this moment and this life. The garden is quiet now in a way that is different from the quiet of the morning and the quiet of the afternoon. The morning quiet was a quiet of anticipation and potential, a quiet that was waiting to be filled by the first stirrings of the bees and the first warmth of the sun and the first sounds of the day that would unfold in its slow, patient rhythm. The afternoon quiet was a quiet of fullness and contentment, a quiet that was filled with the hum of the bees and the rustle of the leaves and the distant rumble of the thunder, and the thousand small sounds of a garden that is alive and thriving and engaged in the endless work of growing and blooming and being. The evening quiet is a different thing entirely, and it is the quiet that you have come to know as the Great Silence, though you have never spoken that name aloud, and you have never tried to explain it to anyone, because it is not the kind of thing that can be explained or described or shared in words. The Great Silence is the quiet that settles over the garden after the bees have returned to their hives, and the light has faded from the limestone, and the stars have begun to appear in the darkening sky, and the world has let go of the concerns and the activities of the day, and has surrendered itself to the rest and the darkness and the slow, patient work of the night. It is a silence that is not empty, but full, not an absence of sound, but a presence of something that is beyond sound, and that can only be felt in the deepest parts of yourself, when you are still and quiet and willing to let go of the thoughts and the worries and the small, persistent voices that fill your mind during the waking hours. You stand in the curve of the skeps, and you listen to the great silence, and you feel it settling over you like a second robe that is made not of wool, but of stillness and peace, and the slow, steady passage of time that means nothing and everything all at once. The bees are silent now, and the only sound that comes from the straw domes is the faintest whisper of air moving through the entrances as the guard bees continue to fan their wings and to regulate the temperature of the hives through the cool hours of the night. This sound is so soft that you cannot hear it unless you bring your ear very close to the opening and hold your breath and listen with an attention that is complete and unwavering, and even then you are not sure whether you are hearing the bees or whether you are imagining them, or whether the sound is simply the product of your own desire to feel connected to the small sleeping creatures that have entrusted their lives to your care. You do not need to know the answer, and you do not try to find it, because the garden is not a place for certainty or for answers, but a place for the kind of quiet acceptance that comes from living in the presence of things that are older and wiser and more patient than any human being could ever be. The limestone wall has faded completely now, and it is nothing more than a darker shape against the deep blue of the evening sky. A shape that you know is there because you have stood beside it so many times, and because your body remembers its presence and its solidity, and the way it has sheltered the garden and the skeps and the bees through all the seasons and all the years that you have been the keeper of this small enclosed world. The stars are brighter now, and there are more of them than there were just a few minutes ago, and you can see the faint, scattered band of light that stretches across the sky from one horizon to the other, and that the brothers in the monastery call the Milky Way, and that you have always thought of as a river of light, or a path that leads to somewhere you cannot see and do not need to see. The stars do not make any sound, and they do not ask anything of you, and they do not care whether you look at them or ignore them, or spend your entire life with your eyes fixed on the ground and your attention focused on the small, immediate things that are within your reach and within your care. They simply are, and they have been for longer than anyone can comprehend, and they will be for longer than anyone can imagine. And this is a kind of comfort that is different from the comfort of the wall and the comfort of the bees and the comfort of the straw and the thatch and the familiar weight of the smoker in your hand. It is a comfort that comes from knowing that you are small, and that your life is brief, and that the things you do and the things you worry about and the things that keep you awake in the darkness of your cell are ultimately insignificant in the face of the vast, silent, enduring universe that spreads out above you and around you and through you. The great silence deepens as the night progresses and the last traces of the day fade from the sky and the air grows cooler and the dew begins to form on the grass and the leaves and the domed tops of the skeps. You can feel the dampness in the air, and you can smell it too, a clean, fresh scent that rises from the earth and the plants and that mingles with the fading scent of the lavender and the rosemary and the wild thyme that grows between the flagstones. The thunder that rumbled on the northern horizon through all the hours of the afternoon has faded completely now, and there is no trace of it left in the air or in your memory, except the faint, lingering sense that it was there and that it might return tomorrow, or the day after, or not at all, and that this uncertainty is not a problem to be solved, but simply a part of the larger pattern of the weather and the seasons and the slow, patient unfolding of the world. You do not think about the thunder, and you do not think about the things that it might signify, or the things that might be happening in the places where the thunder was loudest, and the sky was darkest, and the rain fell in sheets that turned the roads to mud and the fields to quagmires. Those places are far away, and they are beyond the wall, and they are not your concern, and they have not been your concern for many years, and you have learned to let them go and to turn your attention instead to the things that are here and now and real and present and within the small circle of your care and your responsibility. You walk slowly across the garden, and your feet find the familiar path of the flagstones without any need for light or guidance, because your body knows the way and has known it for so long that it is written into your muscles and your bones and the soles of your feet. The stones are cool and slightly damp with the dew that is already beginning to settle on every surface, and you feel the moisture seeping up through your soles and into your ankles. And you do not hurry because there is no reason to hurry, and the coolness is not unpleasant, but rather a kind of gentle reminder that the day is over, and the night has begun, and the time for rest and sleep, and the slow, patient work of dreaming is upon you. You pass the well, and you see the dark shape of the bucket resting on the stone rim, and you hear the faint, distant drip of water that falls from the rope and splashes into the darkness far below, a sound that is so soft and so regular that it becomes a kind of heartbeat or a kind of clock that marks the passage of time in a way that is older and truer than any human invention. You pass the pear tree, and you feel the rough bark under your fingers as you reach out and touch it in the darkness, and you think about the fruit that will come later in the summer, and the way the bees will visit the fallen pears when they are overripe and split, and oozing their sweet, fermented juice onto the stones. The tree is old, and its branches are gnarled and twisted, and it has stood in this corner of the garden for longer than anyone can remember, and it will continue to stand there long after you are gone, and long after the skeps have crumbled, and the bees have swarmed and found new homes, and the garden has returned to the wild, patient state from which it came. The door that leads back into the monastery is a dark rectangle in the pale stone of the wall, and you find it with your hand, and you lift the iron latch, and you feel the familiar resistance and the familiar click as the mechanism releases, and the door swings inward on its heavy iron hinges. The corridor beyond is dark and narrow, and it smells of stone and incense and the faint, lingering scent of the meals that were prepared in the kitchen and served in the refectory, and that have now been cleared away and forgotten by everyone except perhaps the mice that live in the walls and that come out at night to search for crumbs and scraps. You walk down the corridor, and your feet find the shallow depression that has been worn into the stones by generations of sandaled feet, and you follow it without thought or effort, and you feel the cool, smooth surface of the wall under your fingers as you trail your hand along it for balance and for comfort and for the simple pleasure of feeling something solid and real and familiar in the darkness. The corridor is silent, except for the soft sound of your own breathing and the faint, distant murmur of the brothers who are still awake in their cells, and who are praying or reading or simply sitting in the darkness and waiting for sleep to come and claim them. You pass the door to the chapel, and you see the faint, flickering glow of the candle that is always kept burning before the altar, a small point of light that is barely visible through the narrow gap at the bottom of the door, and that speaks of a presence that is beyond words and beyond understanding, and that you have learned to accept and to trust without needing to analyze or explain or justify. Your cell is the last door on the left, and you push it open, and you step inside, and you close it behind you with a soft, final thud that seems to seal the garden and the bees and the great silence on the other side, and to leave you alone in the small dark space that is yours and yours alone. The room is cool and quiet, and it smells of wool and straw and the faint, clean scent of the lavender that you hung from the peg last summer, and that has long since dried and faded and lost its potency, but that still holds a ghost of its former fragrance, if you bring your face close and breathe deeply and let your imagination fill in the gaps. You cross the room, and you sit down on the edge of the narrow bed, and you feel the straw mattress shift under your weight and settle into the familiar contours that have been shaped by your body over countless nights and countless hours of sleep and dreaming and the slow, patient work of resting and restoring. You remove your sandals, and you place them side by side on the floor beside the bed, and you lie back, and you feel the roughness of the wool blanket against your skin, and the coolness of the pillow beneath your head, and the solid, reassuring presence of the stone walls that surround you and that have surrounded you through all the nights and all the seasons and all the years of your life in this place. The great silence is with you still, and it fills the cell, and it fills your ears and your mind and the spaces between your thoughts, and you let it wash over you and through you, and you feel the tension of the day draining out of your muscles and your bones, and the small, persistent worries that have accumulated in the back of your mind, dissolving into the darkness, like the thunder that faded on the northern horizon. You think about the bees and the skeps and the straw and the thatch and the small, perfect hexagons of wax that are hidden in the darkness and that are filled with the honey that will sustain the colonies through the winter, and that you will harvest in the autumn and taste on a cold morning when the garden is bare and the skeps are silent. You think about the lavender and the rosemary and the wild thyme that grows between the flagstones, and that will be there in the morning when the sun returns and the light warms the limestone and the bees emerge, and the long, patient work of the day begins again. You think about the wall and the way it has stood between you and the world for so long, and the way it has softened the sounds that come from the valley, and the way it has held the warmth of the sun and released it slowly through the cool hours of the night. And you think about the fading light on the limestone and the way it changed from gold to cream to silver to blue and then to nothing at all. And you realize that this fading is not an ending but a transition, and that the darkness is not a void but a kind of rest, and that the great silence is not an absence, but a presence that has been waiting for you all along, and that will be waiting for you again tomorrow, when the day is done and the bees are closed, and the bees are closed, and the light fades once more from the pale stone of the wall. Your breathing slows and deepens, and your eyelids grow heavy, and the sounds of the monastery fade into a soft, distant murmur that is indistinguishable from the sound of your own blood moving through your veins, and the slow, steady beat of your heart that marks the passage of time in a way that is older and truer than any bell. The great silence wraps itself around you like a blanket, and you sink into it, and you let it carry you down into the darkness and the warmth and the peace that lies at the center of all things, and that is always there and always waiting and always ready to receive you when you are ready to let go of the day and the light and the small, persistent concerns of your waking life. The bees are sleeping and the skeps are silent, and the limestone is cool and dark, and the garden is still, and the stars are shining, and the world is turning slowly beneath you and around you and through you. And you are part of it all, and you are separate from it all, and you are separate from it all, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be, and exactly who you are supposed to be, and exactly who you are supposed to be, and exactly who you are supposed to be. The last thought that passes through your mind before sleep claims you completely is not a thought at all, but an image, a memory of the fading light on the pale stone of the wall, and the way it softened and dimmed and finally disappeared into the blue of the evening. And you hold this image for a moment, and then you let it go, and you surrender to the darkness and the slow, patient work of the night.